Alors, bon après-midi, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue à cette 13e et avant-dernière séance de la première partie de l'audience publique sur le projet Oléoduc Énergie Est, section québécoise. En effet, la séance de ce soir qui porte sur les impacts sociaux, sur l'acceptabilité sociale et sur les enjeux de gouvernance sera donc la dernière séance de la commission pour la première partie de l'audience. Mon nom est Joseph Zayed. Il me fait plaisir de présider cette commission. Je suis accompagné par mes deux collègues, Mme Gisèle Grandbois et M. Michel Germain. J'aimerais également souhaiter la bienvenue aux personnes ressources, tout d'abord du ministère du Développement durable, de l'Environnement et de la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Si la porte-parole voudrait bien se présenter.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Andréane Gagnon, de la Direction générale de l'évaluation environnementale et stratégique. Je suis accompagnée par ma collègue Annie Bélanger, de la même direction, par M. Jean-Yves Benoît et M. Sergio Casanas, des changements climatiques.
Merci, Madame. Du ministère de l'Énergie.
From the Department of Energy and Natural Resources.
Président Richard Sirois.
I'm Richard Sirois for the energy sector. Biofuel supply section, Natural Resources Canada. Benoit Lacasse, Main Officer for Environmental Assessment. I am here with Kim Kaspersky, the Main Director for Research and Development at our Kemet Energy Research Center in Devon, Alberta. Thank you. We'll have also two experts, two presentations today. Mr. Jean-Yves Benoit. First of all, if you want to introduce yourself. Yes, I'm Jean-Yves Benoit. Good afternoon, Director of the Carbon Market Branch at the Department of Sustainable Development, the Environment, and Fight Against Climate Change, Climate Department. Mr. Jean Nollet, do you want to introduce yourself? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm Jean Nollet. I'm the CEO of the Co-op Carbon. Mr. Bergeron, do you want to introduce someone, some new member of your team? No new person this afternoon. Will you table new documents? Do you have any answers in regards to questions? What I propose, Mr. President, is that when we come back from the break, we'll have different documents that we'll table before the Commission. Okay. The Department of the Environment people, do you have any documents or answers, documents you would like to table? We had three questions that we saw that were pending. First one, is it possible to give a progress report about the quantity of fuel consumed in Quebec as per type of fuel and by sector? We did some verifications, and we realized that it's MERN that had the statistic data, and the question was sent to them, and they were more at ease to table the information, so that department will table the information later. The question was made for the forecast yesterday, and so the request was made in regards to the diagnosis over the past 5 years. Okay, yes. Otherwise, there was a question also about have there been shut-offs on drinking water lines because of incidents? And again, we are looking for a list of events in regards to that. We'll provide you with information later. And also there was a question from Ms. Grandbois. What's the position of the department in regards to intervention costs? $617 million. So what about the contingency of 30% for the Etchemin River? Yes, precisely. So for that, we've tabled our answer before the Commission. The departmental approach in regards to the management of risks is based on safe technology use, the reduction of risk at the source, and emergency measures. The action is mainly aimed at doing prevention for the assessment of a project. The department assesses also the location of a project so that it be the most adequate in view of the sensitive elements in the environment. If there's ever a spill, an incident, a spill in this case, the department will make sure that the promoter can manage well the consequences, for example, through the adequate emergency planning, through the PMUs or the emergency measures plan. The department looks at the consequences, the impacts of a spill, and also what needs to be considered in regards to the PMUs. And we have legal instruments which enable us to get reimbursement when there's a sum of money that's due for the intervention. The government does not require a financial guarantee for emergency. No calculation of the intervention cost is requested from the promoter in that context. Considering that, the department has no standing in regards to the 30% contingency element or cost evaluation. We have to clarify the fact that in the framework of the current Energy East pipeline project, the promoter that has not given a project notification nor an impact study, the scenario of the spill on the HMA River was not evaluated by us. We haven't been able to do that, so we can't even say that that spill on HMA River is worst case scenario, depending on the based on the criteria from the Department of the Environment. Thank you. The Department of Energy and Natural Resources. Yeah. I confirm that we received the request. People are processing the demand in-house, and you should get an answer at the beginning of the session tonight. Thank you. I'd like to mention that for this afternoon session, there will be simultaneous interpretation services from English into French and from French into English. So those people wanting those services have to get the headsets at the back. Those following our proceedings online can choose the language they need. So the registries for each one of the rooms are now open. I'd like to remind you of that. You can register so as to be able to ask a question. Considering the number of participants, will proceed with a first round of registrations, and then we'll have an alternation proportionality system. That's why there were more people in the room here as opposed to the people in other rooms. Now, depending on the different attendees in each room, and satellite rooms will proceed. One person, one question, and if we can, we will have another registration round. On the contrary, if there are way too many registrations during the first round, the people that won't be able to ask their questions orally, if they deem it necessary, they will submit their questions in writing to the coordinator before leaving the room. The Commission will examine all the questions and will decide on what to do to give a follow-up according to what's most appropriate. Without further ado, I'll ask Mr. Benoit to make his presentation. This will be for 10 minutes, 10-minute long presentation, and Mr. Julien, my colleague at the table, will show you a map, and that will indicate that you only have 2 minutes left. Same thing with for Mr. Nollet. You'll be reminded 3 minutes before the end of your presentation.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Thank you for having us today to present the cap-and-trade system for the emission of greenhouse gas emissions, the Quebec system. Right from the outset, the Quebec government has adopted some ambitious objectives in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Over the horizon of 2020, we're talking about a 20% reduction under the levels of 1990, and for 2030, a reduction of 37.5% under the 1990 level always. The cap-and-trade system, or the exchange capping system, is at the heart of the action of the government of Quebec in its fight against climate change. Its goal is to introduce a carbon cost in the economy so as to give incentives to behavior modification for the various economic agents. Also, important income will be generated by the implementation of that system. We're talking about more than $3 billion from now until 2020, which are entirely reinvested through the 2013-2020 Climate Change Plan of Quebec. They are automatically reinvested in that fund to encourage adaptation and public awareness measures and adaptation measures. The goal for the government of Quebec is to reduce emissions at source as much as possible in Quebec, and then after that, in a carbon market system, in a cap-and-trade system, which is linked with California and pretty soon also with Ontario. We want to ensure and guarantee the achievement of that objective, at least in the regional area. A little historical background. The government of Quebec, it's really in 2008 that it made the decision to join other Canadian provinces and American states, members of the Western Climate Initiative, which is a coalition or group of governments that had the common objective of fighting against climate change, mostly through the development and implementation of a regional system of cap and trade, capping and exchange of greenhouse gas emission rights. Quebec joined the Western Climate Initiative in 2008. In 2009, the government tabled Bill 42 and adopted that bill, which gives it the necessary powers to put in place a cap and trade system. Bill 42 modified the Environmental Quality Act, and it is now within that system that a cap and trade system has been installed. The terms and conditions of that exchange capping systems are defined in a government regulation, which is the regulations regarding the capping and exchange of greenhouse gas emission rights, which was adopted in 2011 for the first time. Also in 2011, the government of Quebec amended its regulations on the compulsory reporting of some emissions of contaminants in the atmosphere so as to dictate very specifically how the various industrial sectors must account for their greenhouse gas emissions in order to support the implementation of the cap and trade system. The exchange capping system has come into force on January 1st, 2013. 1 year later, January 1st, 2014, we linked our system with California so that the emission rights, the polluting permits to pollute that are issued by the government of Quebec can be used in California for purposes of regulatory compliance there, and any emission rights issued in California may be used in Quebec for purposes of regulatory compliance here. The last point is the adoption of the target of 2030 by government order and council in November, or last November actually. It's 37.5% under the level of 1990 for 2030. So what is the system? Since January 1st, 2013, which is the time where the operationalization started, the system covers the sectors of electricity and the industry. At the beginning, there were approximately 75 or 80 industrial facilities covered, belonging to some 60 businesses. We have a threshold for being subject to that system. The threshold for industrial companies for electricity production was established at 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. With a threshold of 25,000 tons, we can get roughly 80% of all the emissions in the Quebec industrial sector. Since January 1st, 2013, we innovated. We extended the scope of the system in order to cover all the fossil fuel distributors. We're talking about gasoline, diesel, heating oil, heavy oil, and other type of fuels that are used by citizens for transportation or heating up buildings, as well as in Quebec, small and medium-sized businesses. Once again, we target distributors so as to minimize the number of businesses covered, and we had set the threshold at 25 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. An amendment was made in 2015, and since the beginning of the year, we have lowered the threshold for being subject for distributors to 200 liters, so that any fossil fuel which enters into Quebec to be sold and consumed in Quebec is now covered by the cap and trade system, the exchange capping system. So the scope of our system covers about 85% of the total emissions of Quebec, which makes of that tool really the central tool which is at the heart of the fight against climate change in Quebec. Roughly, in a nutshell, how does it work? The first thing that the government did for all the sectors covered was to establish an annual ceiling, for an annual cap for greenhouse gas emissions. Those are the total maximum emissions that can be emitted by all the persons covered. We don't put a cap for each business, but we put an overall cap for the collectivity, for the group. The ceiling goes down year by year so as to guarantee that over the whole region that we will be able to reach the reduction objective that the Quebec government has adopted. For companies that are covered, they have to report annually their greenhouse gas emissions by using the methodologies prescribed on the regulations on compulsory reporting. And the system requires that companies at the end of a period should give a right of emission for each ton emitted and reported for that period. So it's relatively simple. There's 3 minutes left. I'm okay. Some businesses sometimes are facing international competition, and those may receive free emission rights in order to ensure that the system will not be detrimental and will not be a reason to close down businesses here and delocalize them into another jurisdiction where the government or environmental standards are less stringent. This is a system that also gives flexibility to businesses, allowing them to choose when they will invest to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, because we give them the possibility of buying in the short term emission rights of another business. And when they're ready to invest, they can do so. Coverage of emission rights, the remittance is given at the end of each compliance period. For the time being, we have 3 periods, 2013, 2014. 2015 is now finished. 100% of Quebec businesses complied with the regulation. We had a very good success rate, 100% compliance. Second period will be 2015, 16, and 17, and the third period will be 2018, 19, and 20. So those are 3-year periods, and the system will continue with 3-year periods after that. I already have explained somewhat what it is. Those are the various steps. At the beginning of the year, businesses have to report their emissions. Some of them are eligible to receive freely some units all along, and at the end of a period on November 1st, following the end of the compliance period, that's when they have to remit emission rights. If we take the example of a business that emits 100,000 tons a year, during the period 15, 16, 17, they have emitted 300,000 tons. They have to remit 300,000 permits to the government of Quebec. In the example here, that company received 270,000 for free, so it has the choice. It should have reduced its emissions by 30,000, or it can buy 30,000 permits on the market to give them to the government. Businesses may exchange among themselves. I'll just skip to the last slide. We're as part of the Energy East pipeline. The transportation by pipeline or natural gas transportation by pipeline is an activity which is potentially subject or covered by the cap and trade system or the exchange capping system. Now the threshold is 25,000 of CO2 equivalent per year. Based on the information we have, the pipeline would sorry, let me start over again. The sources of emission of a pipeline, based on what I understand, the fact of transporting oil in a pipe doesn't emit any greenhouse gas emissions. It's only the compression stations, the pumping stations, that could emit any greenhouse gas emissions. So those stations in Quebec would be operating with electricity, so mostly non-greenhouse gas emitting. So based on the information available, if correct, the pipeline would be under the threshold of 25,000 tons and therefore not subject to the exchange capping system, the cap and trade system. Thank you very much, Mr. Benoit. We will move immediately to the next presentation by Mr. Jean Nollet. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me for this presentation. I was asked to describe how the Albertan system works that imposes a carbon price on certain businesses in Alberta. So I chose to proceed by comparing the Albertan system with the Quebec system, thinking that this would make things simpler for everybody's understanding, and even for myself. I think it was helpful to make that kind of comparison. So I'll start with some background which I think is important. Actually, Alberta was the first jurisdiction in North America to impose a price on carbon. And today, Alberta especially under the impulsion of the new government, is redefining that approach. So there are several regulations that will be updated during the year. More clarity is now expected concerning the approach that Alberta will use following the tabling of the next budget, which is to occur in the next few weeks. And it's important also to mention that Alberta has put in place an advisory group on oil sands to guide it in the establishing a cap on the greenhouse gas emissions in the oil sands sector, which has to come into force in 2030. So that's a context to tell you that what I'm presenting today is at risk of shifting a little bit during the next few months based on the information available. There's a lot of information available about the directions that we're expecting over time. To put things in perspective very quickly, when we look at the Quebec emissions compared to Alberta, Quebec emits in 2012 emitted 78 million tons, and Alberta in 2013 267 million tons, 3 times more than Quebec for a population that is twice smaller. When we compare both jurisdictions, we can observe that in Alberta, 45%, 46% of all the emissions come directly from the oil sector. If you add electricity generation from coal, you get to 63% for a very significant total of greenhouse gas emissions of the province. This being said, now it's worth it to compare the objectives between Quebec and Alberta. Mr. Benoit presented the objectives for Quebec with minus 37.5% for 2030. Currently in Alberta, there's no overall objective in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions, which has a number on it. There's an objective of reducing the intensity per business of 12% on a historical basis based on 2003-2005 as a baseline. As we will see, it doesn't affect all businesses. However, changes have been announced. We talk about 50% reduction since January 1st, 2016. That's not an announced change, but it's an actual change. But from 2017, the objective would be to be 20% under the level of 2003, 2005 in terms of intensity, always. In terms of the means to be implemented to achieve that objective, as you will have understood with the presentation of Mr. Benoit, in Quebec, we have a cap-and-trade system. So the government establishes a cap, a ceiling, and creates emission rights accordingly and distributes those rights. And one of the ways of distributing emission rights is by selling them at auction, and the proceeds of that auction goes into the Green Fund, which feeds some programs. In Alberta, we have a slightly different system. Rather than having a cap and trade, what we have is a system that would called baseline and credit in English. In French, would say a reference and credit line, a baseline and credit system. Concretely, what we do is that we establish a target, an objective for the companies covered by the regulation, and the businesses that do better than the target that has been set get a credit that they can then sell on the market. Businesses that don't achieve that objective have several ways to comply with the regulation. I will come back to this with some more details, but one of the ways is to contribute to a technological investment fund that has been made up in Alberta by the Albertan government at a given price determined ahead of time. Historically, that price was $15 per ton. So a company that didn't achieve its target for any tons that when they exceeded the target, they had to give $15 per ton to the government, which invested it in its technological development fund. Since very recently, that amount is set at $20 a ton since the beginning of this year, instead of $15 a ton. What we've been announced in terms of coming changes in the next few months is that the baseline that I told you was based on the history dating back to 2003 and 2005 to 2005. In future will be based on the best performance in these activity sector in which the business is located. That's an important change. And from January 2017, the price in order to have access to the technological investment fund of the government will be $30 a ton. So those are very significant changes. Mr. Benoit mentioned that companies that were covered or subject to the regulations in Quebec are businesses that emit more than 25,000 tons. And since the beginning of the year, since the beginning of the year 2015, importers and hydrocarbon importers and distributors were included. In Alberta, the threshold is not 25,000 but 100,000 tons to have a business subject to regulations. But just like in Quebec, there's a plan to make companies starting in 2007. The import and distribution of hydrocarbons is supposed to be subject to that starting in 2017. And the cost for those importing companies and distribution companies that want to reach their target and who want to participate in the technological fund will be $20 per ton in 2017. Will move to $30 a ton in 2018. You will certainly have understood, as Mr. Benoit mentioned, that there is a free allowance for the manufacturing sector covered by regulation in Quebec. So we're in this different system in Alberta, but implicitly there's also a free allowance from the fact that the government grants businesses the right to emit as long as they have not reached the target that has been set for them as part of the baseline and credit system. So implicitly, 85% of all emissions are granted for free in the Albertan system. As I mentioned earlier, there's an important change that is currently emerging in Alberta. Rather than acting on an historical basis and establishing targets based on a historical baseline as we do currently, we're going towards a sector-based baseline. The ways to comply with regulation, Mr. Benoit has described them for Quebec. We talk about internal reductions, free allowance, purchase of rights coming from other businesses, purchase of compensatory credits. When we talk about those compensatory credits, that refers to the purchase of greenhouse gas emission rights coming from players that don't have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. For example, in the agricultural sector or in the refrigerant gases or landfill sites that are not regulated, it's possible for someone that has no obligation to get a credit if they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, there's also purchase at auction sales. We have the same logic as in Alberta, exactly, even with the compensatory credits, except that rather than having a contribution to the fund through a sale by auction, as you understand, the contribution in Alberta is more a royalty for those that exceed the target that has been set for them. When we talk about compensatory credits, just to give you an idea of comparison, it's important to note that in Quebec businesses may comply with the regulation by purchasing compensatory credits from anywhere in the Western Climate Initiative. And there we have MOUs. There's 4 in Quebec, 6 in California, and 13 possibly in Ontario. And we're waiting for quick confirmation on that side. But in Alberta, it's possible to comply through compensatory credits only if you buy them in Alberta. However, they have 33 MOUs in Alberta. In terms of impact now, because that's the question that was asked of me, it's interesting to compare the prices that we have to face in Quebec. We have a floor price for auction sales in Quebec, and you see it on the screen. It fluctuates according to the year and depending on the currency, exchange rate, and inflation. And we can see in that what the carbon price should be in the next few years until 2020. Given what we know in Alberta, we're talking about a higher price per ton, which does not cover exactly the same players as we saw. That thing after 2017 will increase in absolute terms and will depend on what Alberta competitors will impose on themselves on the same markets. If we try to translate this in terms of impacts on a barrel of oil coming from the oil sands, based on the figures we got, we talk about 20 kilograms of CO2 per barrel of oil. And depending on the price of oil, you can have an order of magnitude of what kind of impact this may have on the price of an oil barrel. So it could represent $2.40 per barrel. What does that $2.40 means? You've seen, like me, the oil prices fall precipitously. The price is now at $40 in the U.S., as I heard on the radio just now, in a context where the current cost for a new facility is $75 US, but for an old facility, the cost is only about $35 to $40 US. That $2.40 is certainly significant and not negligible. If we look now at what this means in terms of accumulation in the funds, both the Green Fund in Quebec and the Technological Fund in Alberta, For the year 2015, given the importance of the exchange rate, it gave $830 million in Quebec, which were accumulated as part of the Green Fund. And if we want to compare with Alberta, and here I refer to what is forecast per year with the tech fund in Alberta, we're talking about $3 billion. So $3 billion is 3.6 times more than what we have in Quebec in terms of a fund that has been raised for emissions that are 3.4 higher. So we could claim that in terms of burden on the economy, what is accumulated in the fund is similar in Quebec and Alberta in terms of impact per ton emitted in Quebec and in Alberta. Please conclude. This is my last slide. To complete the picture, we have to keep in mind that Alberta wants to establish a cap of 100 million tons on its emissions from the sector of the oil sands for 2030. So the level being about 70 million tons now. And another important component of the Albertan strategy is that the intent to reduce methane emissions from all the sector of oil in Alberta by 45% until 2025. That covers what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Mr. Nollet. So we'll go immediately to questions. I will leave the floor to my colleague, Mr. Germain. Thank you. My question is for Natural Resources Canada. Of course, I will refer to a document of Environment Canada, but I think that you must know this document. It's a document that was published in 2014 that is called Emission Trends in Canada. In that document, we can see that the intensity of emissions coming from the production arising from the oil sands seems to have been reduced very little between 2005 and 2012. We see that the production intensity is only 1%. The reduction is only 1%. Environment Canada in its document projected that at the time, we have to understand that's in 2014, but that was supposed to be for 2012 until 2020. That department estimated that the emission intensity would go down more drastically or more significantly based on the calculations. It would be about 6% for the whole 8-year period for the oil sands and about 5.5% for conventional production. I don't know if Natural Resources Canada was able to look at that. What I would say at first glance, because those are aggregate figures, when we do forecasting, usually, my understanding of what a forecast is that we have an objective that is set with an action plan, a specific means year by year. Given technology is introduced on a given year, and this should contribute with a certain investment to reduce emissions. So we see that there were expectations of much higher performances for the period to 2012 to 2020 rather than from 2005 to 2012 in terms of emission intensity for production. Are you able to tell us what would make emissions actually go down more significantly in the coming years in the production coming from the oil sands in particular?
I'm not exactly familiar with that document, but I do understand the question. There's two types of oil sand mining, or oil sand production. There's mining and in situ. Their CO2 production rates are quite different. For mining operations, the current technology has reached its limit in terms of CO2 intensity reduction. There was a big drop about in the early 2000s when they dropped the temperature needed for extraction based on research. So that created a significant drop in GHG intensities for mined oil sand. But until or if there are new technologies introduced for mined ore that are not based on the water-based extraction, it's sort of at its limit. There is research right now looking at non-aqueous extraction, that is using solvent, that potentially can reduce GHG intensity. But that is for mined ore, that is solely at the research stage. For in situ operations, where the CO2 intensity is higher than mined ore. The limit there, well, most in situ operations are based on what they call thermal operations, where they heat water to create steam. So the GHG intensity is related totally to the amount of energy needed to heat that steam. Research right now is looking at ways to reduce that energy needed for in situ thermal operations, such as what's called solvent-assisted steam generation, where they would add solvent with the steam, so you don't need as high a temperature, therefore not as much energy, therefore fewer GHG emissions. That has undergone pilot testing, but is not commercially used yet. There is other research looking at, for example, using purely solvent for in situ extraction. But there you'd also have to look at the life cycle assessment for the production of the solvent, for example, as compared to the GHG emissions just from heating water to produce steam, for example. Another potential for in situ extraction, which is actually shows great promise and is potentially being used in Colombia in South America, is what's called toe-to-heel air injection. It underwent research many years ago, was not applied in Alberta, but they might take another look because that does not use any steam. Essentially, sounds bad, but you set the formation on fire, you inject air, and it's the in situ burning of bitumen that then heats the rest of the formation. But I have not seen any proposals to do that in Alberta to date. But I know they're doing that in Europe and in South America. So until new technologies are developed to reduce the GHG emissions, as I said, solvent-assisted, there's potentially ongoing research right now to significantly reduce CO2 emissions, ideas coming out of the University of Alberta. But again, they're just in the R&D stage.
Plus particulièrement, tout à l'heure.
More specifically, earlier in the presentations by Mr. Nollet, we saw that there was an objective behind that, and that was discussed recently when Prime Minister Trudeau went to the United States. There's an objective about the reductions of methane emissions, in particular in oil production. For in situ extraction production, do you think that some progress can be made, interesting progress? Of course, we use natural gas, but could interesting progress be made regarding fugitive methane emissions linked with the production in the oil sands?
Mentioned yesterday, oil sands production doesn't have a lot of fugitive emissions of methane. For in situ operations, the methane is burnt, so the emissions are CO2. Most of the fugitive emissions, as well as venting, comes from conventional oil and gas. And there's a significant research program right now by the federal government looking at all aspects of reducing methane emissions from conventional oil and gas. There's potentially significant reductions that can be made by flaring, venting, fugitive emissions from conventional. But from oil sands, the type of fugitive emissions would be typical as you would find in conventional. For example, from tank storage. How do you reduce emissions from tankage? How do you reduce emissions from well, there's no stacks as such, or let's say from refineries. But from oil sands, the emissions of methane are not as much as from conventional oil and gas. And that's targeting conventional is where you'll get your biggest impacts.
Je vous remercie. J'aurais une autre question.
Thank you. I would have another question, and that one would deal with the estimated production in Alberta, the evolution of the anticipated production in Alberta. You, on your side, your department, are you doing some accounts or projections linked with the oil production in Alberta, particularly by indicating what would be the evolution, for example, in conventional production? Let's say conventional production would change in such and such a way, the oil sands production would evolve in a different way by a certain percentage, and eventually also the shale oil that could happen in Alberta would increase by so much. Does your department compiles any projections for details on that? We'll take the question and we'll come back to you as soon as possible. With the projections as far away in time as possible, we know that the National Energy Board had produced a document very recently, which is called the Energy Future of Canada. That was published in 2016. They make projections all the way to 2040. But if you have any details to give us related to the NEB document with more broken down figures, that would be appreciated.
Produces an annual oil projection report, so we can also get that as well, where they break it down individually.
Just pour compléter.
Just to complement the question by my colleague, in the projection made by the National Energy Board that was mentioned in the Energy Future of Canada, published in 2016, the NEB estimates or projects that oil sands could represent 77% of the whole production of Canada in 2040, compared with 59% now. You mentioned it earlier. Normally, the generation of greenhouse gas by the oil sands is higher than the conventional production. Can we therefore anticipate, all things being equal, that the increase in the proportion of the oil sands production and the total oil production in Canada would tend to by itself to lead to an increase in the intensity of the average number of greenhouse gas emissions per ton of oil produced, without taking into account any reductions that could be associated with the improvement in the technology?
You anticipated the point I was going to say, which was if there are changes in technology, if we extrapolate from current technology and intensities, then just by sheer mathematics or arithmetic, one would project that the intensity of GHGs as compared to conventional oil would increase if the proportion of oil sands bitumen is greater for all oil produced. Although I will add one caveat, is that conventional resources are dropping, which is why there's a bigger fraction of oil coming from what some people call non-conventional reserves, both in Canada and globally. So as the conventional light oil drops, even things other than oil sands become heavier oil. So even if we said no more oil sands, but the conventional reservoirs are heavier and heavier oil, you need secondary, tertiary recovery, more energy intensity, more water use. It's not situation normal for conventional. So if we assume situation the same for oil sands, we can't assume that for conventional going ahead, because the easy oil is gone, or is already getting limited, and to get the heavy oil will take more energy.
Merci.
Thank you. And I will ask you, make a request on you, which we made to your colleagues of Environment Canada yesterday, but just in case you have different references, we would like to ask you, what are for you the best references when we want to use an emission factor for the various categories of oil? If you could confirm what are the best sources of reference that are the most comparable, of course. So we would very much appreciate. And my last question is, I would come back to the very first question by my colleague. He mentioned that the document Emission Trends in Canada by Environment Canada reported a reduction in the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands by less than 1% between 2005 and 2012, but projected an intensity reduction for those same oil sands of 6% between 2012 and 2020. So during an 8-year period, approximately the same length, a period that is coming to an end soon. And on the basis of the comments you made, you seem to say that technological improvements, there's not so many things that are ready for application now. Am I to understand on the basis of your comments that it might be a bit optimistic to hope for a 6% improvement in the energy intensity during that 8-year period?
You have to look at their report to see what they based that reduction on. If they were basing that on technologies that will be implemented during that time, or they're projecting to be implemented, I can't comment until I see what they based their numbers on and if it was due to some technologies they were foreseeing.
Je comprends très.
I understand very well. I understand very well. Would it be possible for you to come back to us with a comment on that? When we would very much appreciate, because that's a way for us to better understand those data. Thank you. Thank you, Madam. I would like to call now Mr. Éric Trottier in Trois-Rivières. Good afternoon, Mr. Trottier. Yes, good day, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner, and Mr. President. I'm Éric Trottier. I'm a citizen of Trois-Rivières. I'm also a member of the Vigilance Committee, Hydrocarbons of Trois-Rivières. I'm also an active member of the Green Party of Canada. I was a candidate of the Green Party of Canada at the last federal elections of 2015 in Trois-Rivières. I'm also an active member of the Quebec Green Party, but I'm not here as an official representative of those two political organizations. My question is about a newspaper article that was published on July 4th, 2013 in the National Post. It said that the Albertan government would be sending $5 billion through Énergie Est to buy 100,000 barrels a day. We know that there was a new NDP government in Alberta that was elected about a year ago, a year and a half. Was this agreement reconducted? My question is, of course, to Mr. Bergeron from the Énergie Est company. I have the copy here of this newspaper article. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Mr. Bergeron, can you answer the question? Mr. President, the content of agreements with shippers, if that's what Mr. Trottier is referring to, are of a confidential nature. You have some shippers that chose to reveal some volumes in particular, which are part of the agreements. Otherwise, our commitment to TransCanada is to not reveal the content of the agreements with the shippers publicly. It's the choice of the shippers themselves. Unfortunately, the answer can be only that, Mr. Trottier, unless you have something specific in the newspaper article that could lead us to something else. No. The way it says in the paper is the new minister, Rachel Notley. It's in English, of course, says quite simply that she would buy for 100,000 barrels a day that she would buy from Énergie Est. Before the election, that's the way it was. Now, after the election, we didn't know whether it would be reconducted. That was my question. Thank you. I'm sorry, sir. Excuse me, Mr. Trottier. What you said earlier is that the government of Alberta would invest in the Énergie Est project. What was the sentence you quoted? The sentence I quoted is that the Albertan government would commit $5 billion with Énergie Est to buy $100,000 per day, 100,000 barrels per day. That's the former Conservative government. And now we have there's a new government there. I would like to know if the agreement had been reconducted with the NDP government in Alberta. Mr. Bergeron, so on that specific point, does that ring a bell? Yes, indeed. In 2013, the Albertan government had made a volume commitment on the line. Now, as I said earlier, I can't reveal the content of any commitments with the shippers. It's their alternative, it's their prerogative. But to your knowledge, the Albertan commitment by the Albertan government does it still hold, or is it no longer valid? I don't have the possibility of revealing, even if it's the government correct. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks to you, Mr. Trottier. Mr. Jean-Denis Julien from Trois-Rivières. Good day, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner. Another reference that leads me to ask some questions. I saw in the New York Times of May 2012, May the 9th, Mr. James Sanson, who is director of the Maza Golder Institute, stated that the deposit of the oil sands could release 240 billion tons of carbon. So 2,000 million barrels, 2 billion barrels in the atmosphere. Based on that, there's an article that was published in Nature, in the Nature Journal on February 24th, 2016, which mentions that the world carbon budget that is eligible if we are aiming for a world that would be under 2 degrees Celsius was 160 billion. And I would add, as an aside, I'm aware that Alberta has a cap of 100 megatons, but from that ceiling leaves room for an expansion of the oil sands. It could go from 2.5 to 5 million barrels a day, from what I can see. Taking that into account, I would like to know what TransCanada thinks of those data. Mr. Bergeron. Mr. President, I will ask Ms. Bars to answer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I can't speak specifically to those numbers without looking at them closer, but you know, as we've noted before, the Alberta government has released significant increases to their greenhouse gas program, including the cap on the oil sands, as well as increasing the price on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as tying compliance to industry-leading performance. And so we believe the government is making a significant step forward in terms of attempting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands.
Est-ce que c'est pas dans les circonstances?
Is it, with the current technologies, is that step sufficient to help reduce a big gap between 240 billion and 160 million, based on the figures I have? I must confess, Mr. Julien, that myself, I would have been confused or uncomfortable with a question like that comes and puts someone on the spot with new data, and we ask persons to comment on that. It's a bit difficult, and I will have to accept the answer as it was presented. All right, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Julien. Mr. Germain. Mr. Bergeron, sorry to come back again to the charge without asking you to disclose any agreements with the Alberta government. Little clarification on the basis of the 2013 article, and I would like to take advantage of that if Mr. Trottier is still here, and if he can at least give us the hyperlink for this National Post article so that we can read it, at least to understand the background. The Albertan government itself, is it an oil producer? Does it have a crown corporation or something like that? If you wish, we could do a research, Mr. Commissioner, to find out in what capacity was the government of Alberta interested in taking part in Energy East. Once again, there are details that I can't reveal, but I prefer to take a look at that closely. At the same time, the National Post article, if we have the hyperlink, you'll be able to read it just as I can. And that's the 2013 article. As I explained earlier, when we removed the port in Quebec, we had to go back to the shippers and find out, was the agreement reconducted integrally or with some changes? That's the type of detail. I don't have it. I have to validate and find out what I can reveal on that. If you take knowledge of that article, we'll be in a better position to judge, and we can ask questions. Indeed, in 2013, there was an agreement with the Alberta government, which was part of the agreement. We'll read the article, and if need be, we'll ask more questions about it. Thank you. Ms. Grandbois Could we agree that following your verifications, you would come back to us with the information you can give us? I'll try as much as possible to give you an answer today, but we will come back to you with a formal answer. Thank you. Mr. Stephen Guilbeault from Laval. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner. I would like to ask a question to the Trans-Canada representative. On March 7th of this year, Marc Lessard, a resident of East Montreal, asked, does Trans-Canada guarantee that there will be no export from the Montreal port, the Port of Montreal? The answer by Mr. Bergeron, which is on the BAP site, I'll quote that integrally. Trans-Canada, Mr. President, has no project to export crude oil from Quebec. I tabled with the BAP a document where all the paragraph of the response by Mr. Bergeron is. But in a document that Trans-Canada tabled before the BAP, document PR 2.1.12, page 7.5 and 7.6, let me read an excerpt of that document. A total volume of 42,900 cubic meters per day, so 270,000 barrels per day, remains covered by a contract or in terms of the service agreements to be exchanged. Talks with shippers concerned continue regarding the processing of those volumes. That is also part of the updated evidence that was tabled by Trans-Canada before the National Energy Board. So my question to Trans-Canada, to the Trans-Canada representative is, does the company intend to export crude oil from Quebec? Because we're told one thing and it's contrary. And on the other hand, if indeed the company still thinks that it will export up to 270,000 barrels a day, how many more ships does that represent on the St-Laurent River on a daily or weekly basis? Thank you. Thanks to you, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. President, let me give you the facts. The initial Energy East program, as presented in 2013 and 2014, had an oil shipping port in Quebec, as you know, and our shippers had signed agreements for 995,000 barrels a day to supply the refineries and load ships in Quebec and New Brunswick. When we withdrew the oil port from Quebec, we went back to the shippers and we managed to renew more than 700,000 barrels a day of capacity with our shippers, and the 270,000 barrels that Mr. Guilbeault is talking about. Yes, there is a desire on the part of the producers to have access to an oil port in Quebec. Now, the Energy East project, as it is been submitted to the National Energy Board with the amendment of last December, does not include any port in Quebec. So the situation is that if in one day, in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, a site is identified and shippers wish us to pursue a project to have a port in Quebec, we will have to present a new application to the National Energy Board. So the Energy East project in its current form does not include any oil port in Quebec. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Ms. Grandbois. Mr. Guilbeault, you might not have had an opportunity to hear the discussions during session 2, and the ideal thing would be for you to come back, but I will summarize to you as faithfully as possible what was said. We asked a question. It's a compliment to your question and to what Mr. Bergeron said. We asked the question from Suncor and asked them, could they intend to export oil that would come from the Energy East pipeline? Would they intend to export it directly from the port of East Montreal? The Suncor representative indicated to us last Tuesday that they did not intend to do any export from Montreal East, and if ever there would be any export on their part, that would be done from the St. John seaport. And we asked the same question to the Valero people, who told us that they did not intend either to export from their facilities. As for the exact words and details, I will refer you to session number 2. If you allow me, I understand what you're saying, Ms. Grandbois, but on the one hand, the TransCanada representative says we have no project. He talks about a TransCanada project, but we're still making plans, and they talk about talks with shippers to export up to 270,000 barrels a day through Quebec. And that it could be Suncor, it could be Valero, or it could be other businesses that transport oil. It's not necessarily only refiners that could do it. So I find it a bit difficult to follow TransCanada on that question, because they seem to say one thing and it's opposite. They state things before the BAP while they're tabling documents which go against what is publicly said. It's very confusing. Listen, I think the answer was given. I can understand your discomfort. Those are words that the Commission will take into account also in its analysis. Thank you, Mr. Guilbeault. Mr. Patrick Bonin in Laval. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Bonin. Good afternoon, Commissioners, Madam Commissioner. I'd like to come back quickly on the beginning of this hearing. During the first evening, actually, I asked a question and expressed a concern as to the fact that with the new world context of 1.5 degrees Celsius have increased the reality in terms of consumption and greenhouse gas objectives worldwide. In order to be able to limit that global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are talking about being at 100% renewable energy, so no consumption of oil, gas, or coal from now until 2050. So putting it back to zero, unless I misunderstood, I thought you had said that the justification period of the project, the sessions about the justification of the project, and the session about greenhouse gas emissions would allow us to have presentations about that. What does it mean in terms of world estimates, this new reality?
I'm sorry, I was distracted for a few seconds. Would you mind repeating the end, Mr. Bonin? I thought that I understood that we should have maybe a presentation to know what that 1.5 degrees Celsius new reality meant by different representatives from Environment Canada or the government of Quebec. We should have that presentation so that we could give a framework around the project in view of the world reality. Perhaps I've missed that presentation, but correct me. Has there been a presentation? If not, then is it possible to have the presentation made rapidly, provided by the representatives? There have been 4 presentations made by experts, 2 yesterday, 2 today. If you've listened to the 4 ones, there are no other ones. We haven't planned for future ones, and there aren't other ones in the past either. Mr. Germain, the Environment Canada representatives are not here this afternoon. They were there yesterday. A question was asked regarding specifically to that commitment, 1.5 degrees Celsius. The answer, if I can summarize it, is to the effect that Environment Canada people were working on that in view of the future outcomes, and they didn't have any information to supply us regarding the commitments, the Canadian commitments. That's an information so that the Canada doesn't share in regards to those commitments related to the Paris summit. We haven't gotten the data. If we would have been able to get some, we would have asked them to elaborate on those data, but without data, this cut the discussions short. That's all we can say. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you asked the question to the Department of Natural Resources of Quebec in order to have a forecast of the oil consumption in Quebec. I'm sorry, there are a lot of documents on the BAP's website, but, well, the information hasn't come yet, unfortunately. This was promised to us. We should get it within the next days. I'll let the spokesperson from the Natural Resources Department, he'll give us a different answer or more precise than the one I gave you. Mr. President, the forecast has been tabled. That's the past consumption by type and by sector. I will table it. Oh, you will table it now. Okay, today. Thank you, Mr. Benoit. This is about the past consumption. We asked for both, by the way, but in two different instances. We've asked for the past 5 years consumption and also a forecast in view of the future years. Thank you for the information. My question is the following. Basically, I made a remark to the effect of saying that the Navius report, and even themselves, they have introduced it. It shows results which are significantly different from another study, which was made by the Palminas study, which deems that the greenhouse gas emissions would be 10 times more regarding the oil production. The differences are accounted for by different variables and assumptions that are used. Amongst things, the oil price, the construction capacity, and the railway transportation capacity, the difference between Brent, WDI, WSC, and the different types of oil on the market. But I think that we have to keep that in mind because, unfortunately, we haven't seen any justification that accounts for that major difference, unless I didn't understand it right. But what we should know from Mr. Navré, from the representative from Navius, the firm Navius, are the assumptions in regards to the difference of price on the market. In his presentation, he shows assumptions. For example, if the price of oil goes up, if it remains stable, and so on, goes down a bit, there was an overhead number which I could quote here for you eventually. But anyway, I think you could see what I'm trying to say. There are three scenarios: same price, same level, pricing going up or coming back to the standard average. And then it says the oil price going a little bit higher, slightly, the greenhouse gas emissions would be, which would be much higher. And so is it possible to have some numbers in regards to the emission differences, what accounts for these different scenarios? Because all we see is an increase, but there are no numbers provided by Navius. Ms. Gambois?
Monsieur Peters.
Mr. Peters from Navius, he's not here. So I'll try to answer. From what I understand, based on his comments yesterday, is that they haven't made any numbers-based assessment to assess the impact of change for a year and a half. They've tried qualitatively to explain to us, based on their judgment, their own qualitative assessment, the trends or the impacts that this might create. But to my knowledge, they haven't made any quantitative assessment. This was purely they just tried to determine what could be the consequences of that change qualitatively. So in regards to that study, as you've mentioned, there are the conclusions of the study itself. It shows results from different studies, amongst which the Barbina Institute. But for the Commission, it's clear that we must consider all of these sources. That's quite clear. We have to be critical. The fact that there has been a presentation, and Mr. President has mentioned this many times, does not mean that it gives you an idea of the type of assessment made by the Commission. This is just an input. The Commission will analyze the Navius and Palminas studies, but it could also examine any other type of studies. My colleague has underlined this, and she's done so well. There are experts that have been invited. This does not mean that the Commission agrees with their point of view or with their analysis. Well, I can't get an answer, unfortunately. Well, rapidly. Is it possible for, Natural Resources Canada, they're here, so can they tell us what this means, 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of hydrocarbon consumption, the oil? What does that mean worldwide? This is a new reality. Nobody has said anything about that. This is important. There are studies that have been published internationally demonstrating that I told you. 100% of renewable energies. Did I tell you about that? Can we have the advice from the department? Yes, fair. Natural Resources Canada, we cannot answer this question today, but we'll come back later with the written answer as quickly as possible. Ms. Gambois, I understand very well that you cannot give a written estimate about such a vast question, but qualitatively, I thought that you could at least, well, by the way, this is a question that's not easy to answer, but I think that Mr. Bonnet is expecting a qualitative answer, assuredly. Now, if the planet is serious in its objectives to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 1.5, what does it mean? Can you make a comment? Could you give us a general comment? Otherwise, we'll wait for your written document.
En fait, je pense que c'est vraiment une question qui est en dehors de notre champ d'expertise.
This is a question that goes beyond our expertise framework, our scope of expertise. So we'll have to get information from our own services in-house. I'm sorry, Ms. Grandbois. Mr. Benoit Launay, by the way, would you want to say something about that very vast question? No? Mr. Nollet, no? All right, Mr. Nollet. I would like to call now, Mr. Bonnet, sorry. I would like to call Madame Irène Dupuis here. She's in the room.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I just have a small request to make to the promoters. Before starting with my question, last night we saw a series of answers. 7 or 8 times the same answer was provided from the promoter. He was really talking about the virtues of the pipeline as opposed to the railway. Citizens take the time to prepare questions. They live very far. They travel long distances to come here. They prepare questions with a lot of effort, and their goal is to know better the Energy East files and to know all of its characteristics, and we try to encompass that. When we receive 6 or 7 times the same answer in the same evening, personally, I think this is a lack of respect for citizens attending the hearings. So I would ask the gentleman who's answering the questions on a regular basis to, well, I'm asking, could you ask him, please, to stop doing that, because this is extremely depressing and will end up in depression collectively. Well, I would like to tell you, madam, I hope we avoid that. If I would have had even the slightest intuition about that, I wouldn't have waited for you to say the same remark. I agree with you. Even yesterday I was wondering, is it me that was tired or not? I expressed this during the whole evening. You're right, by the way. However, we have to say, to defend him, that there were similar questions that were based on different perspectives. And each time the promoter was very polite, but indeed answered with the very same answer. Given the circumstances, because of what I've just told you, I don't think that the promoter lacked respect either vis-à-vis the Commission and vis-à-vis the citizens. I'm sorry to have a different opinion than you. We are entitled to our own opinion. Thank you. This morning I've heard, I can't remember this, but what's the name of the lady? Ms. Gagnon. Yes, Ms. Gagnon. She was saying that she couldn't make an assessment of the worst-case scenario because the project notification had not been tabled by TransCanada. And she said also, if I remember correctly, that the economical assessments haven't been started for the same reason. And in terms of the bargainings, the native negotiations, the consultations with the Aboriginals, they haven't been able to be started either for the same reason. Now, my question is, and I'm trying to clarify this. My concern regarding this, you said that the current BAP mandate was to gather information, to make representations before the NEB in order to give information about the acceptability of the project so that the government of Quebec be able to use the thinking and the analysis of the Commission during its intervention before the National Energy Board. So if there has been no cross-assessment of the worst-case scenario this wasn't made by the concerned departments in the provinces where this will occur, so these studies, are they going to be made for you, for the Commission? Will this be ready? Will this be on time? By the delays, will it be available? Will the studies be available for your reporting? And so when our Quebec government will appear before NB, they won't have those data. So the fact that the Quebec law was not complied with by not tabling the notification, the consequence of this is that we won't be able to have the full expertise ready for the government so as to be able to make our own representation. This is a very fundamental question. You've talked about two things. As usual, yes, indeed. So I'd like to take advantage of something that you said. In order to clarify things with the spokesperson from the Department of the Environment, as a matter of fact, indeed, we asked the question twice because this also came from the attendees. We wanted to know what was the intent of the department regarding consulting with the Aboriginal communities. And one of the spokespersons told us that we had to wait for the project notification, which was not submitted. There was another resource person that attended another session that told us that apparently the consultation would start before the project notification is tabled. I would like to ask Ms. Gagnon to clarify that, and then I'll ask Mr. Germain, my colleague, to continue. Regarding specifically the Aboriginal consultation, as soon as we received a project notification and impact study, it started, no doubt. But further, as for the consultation before that, I can tell you that there are discussions underway in order to determine how this can be done, but nothing has been cast in stone for the moment, but we would like this to be included. But it all depends on how you go about things, and it depends on what document you're going to consult. It's not easy to start up a discussion given the plethora of documents provided by TransCanada currently. So I must understand what? That there's no firm position from your department for now? Mr. Germain. Yes, Madame Dupuis, I'd like to take advantage of this to explain, well, the problem that you mentioned. Well, the Commission was thinking about the same question. If we draw a parallel between the assessment procedure, the environmental impacts by virtue of 3151 promoter tables a project notification. Section 6.3 gives a power to the minister to give a mandate to the BAP in order to investigate any matter about the quality of the environment. The minister submits that to the board. This is a 6.3. We're not investigating a project. This is quite easy. We're not playing with words here. We're investigating about one question or two matters regarding the quality environment in view of the project. So there's a clear distinction to make between both, and the Commission was asking the question, obviously, given a 6.3 context, we should not try to simulate a 31.3. 31.3 is the mandate that's been given, as opposed to 31.3 at the BAP. This is 6.3. It's the case for 6.3, not 31.3. Another distinction, if we had been in a 31.3 framework, we would have gotten a project notification with a preliminary impact study that would have been tabled before the department, which, through its interministerial consultations, would have asked a series of questions, 1, 2, 3 questions, let's say, to the promoters over a few months, and following that, we would have a mandate would have been given to the BAP, an impact study which have been deemed, which needs to be deemed sufficiently complete in order to go into a public hearing process. If you want to draw a parallel with the federal process, which is submitted to the NEB, the National Energy Board has received documents from the Energy East promoter, but still has not declared that the file is complete. Complete does not mean that the NEB no longer has questions. It just means that it's sufficiently complete for NEB to initiate the formal process over 15 months. When that process starts, when we see the NEB procedures during, at earlier projects, we see that the NEB asks questions over a few months to the promoter. Questions are asked for over a few months, and this is similar to the process that the Department of Sustainable Development carries whenever there's a project notification that is submitted. The BAP currently is in a 6-3 framework and is quite ahead, or the situation is premature. It's so advanced that it's premature in regards to full or complete file. It's a complex file, but it's not deemed to be complete by the National Energy Board. So we are stuck with that somehow. Of course, we asked ourselves the same question. We tried to navigate through that in view of the 6.3 framework, which are questions in regards to the quality of the environment that were submitted by the Minister of the Environment. So that's why we won't have questions which are precise about all the hundreds of questions that would have been asked by the Department of Sustainable Development for months after receiving a preliminary impact study. So we're stuck in that context. Ms. Grandbois, to complete on what my colleague has just said, to come back to the elements, the items that you've mentioned in your question at the beginning, there are a few items that you've mentioned which are clearly not part of the BAP's mandate, the official consultation matter, the obligation to consult with Aboriginal nations. This is not our mandate. So you mentioned two or three things, notably regarding the potential spill scenarios. The costs regarding that. The Commission, when it does its analysis, its work, has different sources. If the context is such that the Department of the Environment hasn't been able to do the work that they would do in a different context, it does not mean that the Commission receives no information. We have different sources of information. We do carry out our own analysis, which means that we will still be able to come up with information for the Government of Quebec for that subject in our report. And it's for sure, the BAP's report will be one of the items that will contribute to the thinking process of the Government of Quebec. It won't be the only one, but we'll be able to address that item, even though the Department of the Environment can't think of that, because anyway, we have different sources of information. So you're deprived from the expertise and the thinking from one of our best resources, one of our best department. This is a limiting factor. Oh, you're such a diplomat. Thank you, Madam.
Monsieur Nollet, je pense que...
Mr. Nollet, I think you wanted to say something.
Je risquerais une...
I will risk an answer to Mrs. Grandbois. The link between the planetary goals and the oil operations. Some scientific articles have been published to the effect of saying that a non-negligible part of oil reserves should remain underground if we want to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. If we want to reach that goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, they should remain underground. I have to verify this, but I think this was 30 or 40% of proven. Speak louder. You're close to the microphone, but you don't speak loud enough. Okay. I don't know what you heard. I don't know what you haven't heard, but it's okay to now, till now. From memory, I think that we're talking about 30 to 40% of the proven found oil reserves, which should remain underground in order to comply with the 1.5 goals arising from the Paris Conference. Thank you so much, Mr. Louis Casavant, Trois-Rivières.
Oui, bonjour.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Casavant.
Il a été question hier soir.
Yesterday in the evening, there was addressed the matter of the distance between the pipeline and the gas. I think there was a difference between radius and diameter. Cratera created by the possible explosion of a 30 diameter line. We have to know what's the distance that the oil line and the gas pipeline. I mean, are we talking about a distance equal to 15 meters or higher than 15 meters? The distance between the gas pipeline and the oil pipeline. I'd like to ask Mr. St-Laurent. Mr. President, we are along, well, the project proposed gazoduc TQM around, it's 135 kilometers. We're along that distance. That's the distance that we're planned for, which means that we'll have a minimum 10 meter. That's the minimum. It could be more than that, but minimum 10 meters. That's the minimal distance that we'll have. Does that answer your question? I thought the answer was clear yesterday. Do you want to clarify your question? If it's not clear, what are you looking for precisely? Okay. There was a confusion yesterday between the diameter and the radius. So we wanted to know if this changes the diameter and the radius. You're talking about what? The distance between the oil pipeline and the oil pipeline. It's a distance. It's not a radius. It's not a diameter. You want to know the distance. That's it? Wait a minute. I'm going to read it again because hold on a minute. You want me to give the floor to someone else and then you'll have some time to reconsider the question? In the meantime, you're not losing your opportunity. Oh, I'll come back in a few seconds. I'll give somebody else to ask a question and then I'll ask you to come to the floor again. Ms. Chaliquet in Laval.
Bon après-midi.
Good afternoon, madam. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. President, commissioners, ladies and gentlemen. Is it okay? Yes, things are going very well. I'm sorry. There's some echo, but that's all. Okay. I want to ask a question regarding the exports possibilities for Quebec. My question is, as you'll see, this requires precisions about that topic, which is quite concerning. My question is linked with the topics that we have to cover today, social acceptability, which involves trust and credibility. Mr. President, on March the 7th, regarding a question that was asked by Mr. Maclessar, I believe. He was asking if TransCanada could guarantee that there wouldn't be any operations from the Port of Quebec. Mr. Bergeron provided an answer which seemed to calm down that concern. He said that TransCanada is convinced that their St. John terminal would be an advantage because the port would receive their main VLCs, very large crude carriers. The revised request of TransCanada presented in December 2015, this is less than 13% of the fleet in Saint-Jean for Energy East. And so the documents of TransCanada show it clearly. Suezmax and Aframax sizes would be there, which are smaller. So my question is the following. Given the fact that Suezmax oil ships will carry a lot of crude oil from Energy East, from St. John, and given the fact that these Suezmax oilers already visit the Port of Quebec, the region, and the Lévis, and Aframax also go there. They go to the Sorel and Montreal port. Why should we be reassured that there wouldn't be an export of oil from the ports of Quebec that would be linked with the Energy East project for today and for the future? This question is related to another attendee's question, so I'll ask the promoter to answer. Mr. President, I see two different things at stake here. Regarding the St. John port, we have assumptions related to maritime traffic and the size of ships. These are assumptions. We can't know with absolute certainty what type of traffic we'll have. So we have different scenarios, and TransCanada cannot affirm without a doubt, the shadow of the doubt, how many ships we'll have, of what size in St. John. This will be up to the potential clients to choose. Regarding the presence of a port in Quebec, there's no longer a port in the Energy East application before the NEB. There's no permit request or application that will be made by virtue of NEB, Energy East, on behalf of Energy East before the different authorities that would include a port. If ever there's a desire to add on a port for Quebec, this would be the object of a new application. Mr. Germain? Mr. Bergeron, this is a sub-question. From Lévis until St. John's. St. John, your pipeline as planned, what type of capacity does it have? Daily capacity? Mr. Commissioner, the design is made in such a way that we have 1.5 million barrels over the whole pipeline. 1.1. So Lévis could take 0 barrels. Everything could be sent to St. John. 1.1. So Suncor or Valero, when they need a lot, a batch, I mean, there are some valves that will be turned on, and so the batch will be delivered. But the periods when Suncor and Valero won't receive any crude oil, 1.1 million barrels will flow per day. The whole system is designed in such a way that we can deliver 1.1 million barrels per day on the main line. So, Ms. Gambois?
So what I understand from the question by Madam and by Mr. Guilbeault earlier, we had other interventions last week on that, is that people tell themselves, okay, that's the first step. The foot is in the door. Will they come back in a few years from now to say, now there's a port project and so on? The question I would have for you here, what I understood from your presentation is that the Energy East pipeline project on the table could be viable. In order to be viable for you, it does need to have a port in Quebec. So if in a few years there is a port project in Quebec, the reason and saying that you need that port to ensure the profitability or the viability of the Energy East pipeline, you couldn't make that argument. Correct, Ms. Commissioner. Our application to the board has an important chapter, a significant commercial aspect. The initial application that referred to 995,000 barrels a day of capacity. In our amendment, if you wish, we had to correct that in a way or update this because the project had changed considerably. So at the National Energy Board, in order to come to the conclusion that this is a national interest project, that's a major project, a major component in the analysis. We talked a lot about environmental impacts and others, but I would tell you that the economic justification and the interest of this project for the country is an important concern of the board. So you have a whole chapter, a whole component associated with the commercial justification. So that was simply a way to update the board about the fact that we no longer had the exact same project, commercially speaking. It was not exactly the same project. Now, in terms of scope, we removed the port in Quebec and we maintain, if you wish, the other configuration with the port in St. John and the connections to the refineries. So that was the objective of the document that was tabled with the National Energy Board. It was to cover that aspect, but it is totally clear that the company has committed that if eventually there is an interest for shippers, and if ever there was a site that would be selected as an interesting site, that would be the topic of a new project from A to Z. Totally new project. Can I confirm, is it correct to say that the existence of a port in Quebec is not necessary for the viability of your project, and it could not be an argument that would be used X years from now? That's correct. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Kate. So back to you, Mr. Casavant. Yes. I would like to know the distance between the oil pipeline and the gas pipeline. Which of the distances is equal or lower than 15 meters? if I think I understood, Mr. Casavant, between what you're asking and between Mr. St-Laurent answered earlier. Mr. St-Laurent, you said that there are 135 kilometers of pipeline where they're alongside one another. You would have side by side the Energy East oil pipeline and the Trans-Quebec Maritime gas pipeline. And you mentioned that for that 135 kilometers, the distance between the gas pipeline and the future oil pipeline is always at the minimum 10 meters. The question by Mr. Casavant is, where is it lower than 15 meters? So are you in a position, are you able to tell us, is there 50 kilometers of the line where it would be more than 10 meters and less than 15 meters, between 10 and 15 meters, since it seems to be the concern? I suppose you can't come up with a figure like that, just like that. It's probably not that difficult to calculate. I don't want to presume. Mr. Casavant, just before the promoter answers, did my colleague represent well your question? Yes, that's it. So, Madam Commissioner, indeed, we will have to look in more detail. It's not that simple because the line is not necessarily always at a given distance from the boundary of the right-of-way. It varies depending on the obstacle, depending on the terrain. So we will have to look. I will look at that aspect. And I will tell you again, though, that we made calculations, and in case of an incident on the gas pipeline, which is the worst-case scenario, because there might have the presence of an explosion, then the crater, the impact here is about 6 meters in diameter. And that's very clear. And we're just asking you an estimate, really a rough estimate, an overall estimate. I think nobody needs a number here, as very, very, very precise number, up to 1/10 of a kilometer. So, Mr. Bergeron, you will give us an answer in writing, I suppose, for that question? Yes, yes, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Casavant. Mr. Mac Brulman in Trois-Rivières. Yes, good day. Since last night, the elephant has entered the room. When I'm talking about the elephant, I'm talking about the greenhouse gas emissions. As I feared at the beginning of the sessions, we still don't have any elephant tamer, because we were entitled to an economic study yesterday which has nothing scientific. And so I, as a scientist, I'm in a situation where I have nothing in front of me. I'm forced today again to ask a question which is more of an economic nature rather than scientific, and I find this really deplorable. In a report from the Canadian Roundtable on the Economy and the Environment dating back to 2009, which is entitled Achieving 2050, which we see here, there is at figure 1 a graph where we see what would be the carbon price in Canada in order to be able to respond to greenhouse gas reduction imperatives. So we can see that in 2020 it should be $100 per ton, and it should quickly go up to $300 a ton around to 2030. From that, we can know why that roundtable was dissolved. But anyway, supposing a barrel price, a WTI price at $50. So let's presume that around 2020, maybe it should be around $50 per barrel. From what value of the carbon tax would TransCanada lose its order book from the Alberta producers? Mr. Bergeron, did you go through that type of thinking? Mr. President, I think that some comments saying that the answers are always the same might be due to the fact that in terms of the basic assumptions, we may differ. And what I've been trying to do in the last 2 weeks is to explain a little bit the context in which the industry is developing in Alberta. And let me come back once again on the famous ceiling on greenhouse gas emissions. That will force, as Ms. Côté from the Canadian government, that will force producers to work, and also the carbon tax also will force them to work differently in order to improve their extraction techniques so that there is currently a dynamic within the industry. Efforts are being made to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions and work with new ways of doing things so as to produce oil by emitting as little greenhouse gases as possible. So if we were in a static environment where nothing evolves, maybe we could indeed make a calculation and come up with an answer. But it was mentioned even yesterday, just the situation of the oil prices in the last 2 years is such that any calculation like that would have very little, would be very imprecise and would be very unlikely to come to a number which will actually happen. So what I would tell you is that there's a dynamic right now with the carbon price system, with the cap of 100,000 tons, with technological innovations, and all this will evolve and shift. And I think what's important is that companies should make all the required efforts. Of course, governments are there to support them. And there is an effort that is being made right now. TransCanada participate in the efforts that all Canadian businesses are doing. Ms. Grandbois, so I would like to do some mileage with that. I would like to make a link with the presentation by Mr. Benoit, also by Mr. Nollet. Mr. Benoit, in particular, you mentioned in your presentation that the cap and trade system, SPEDE in French, I don't know if it should be pronounced speed, as I wish. Okay, I think I'll spell it SPEDE. You mentioned that this objective of that system is to lead to behavior changes by businesses. In the case that the question of Mr. Brulman, we're talking about industrial behavior modification for industries or also for citizens. If we talk about behavior modifications for companies, to come back to Mr. Brulman's questions, I would like to hear you, Mr. Benoit, and Mr. Nollet also, if you want to complement. So in your opinion, from what price per ton of CO2 equivalent tons can we really have an impact on shippers in that case, or on companies in general, and the context in which all of that evolves? Thank you. I'll try to answer your question. Maybe I'll start by a clarification. The exchange capping system has as its goal to intervene on emissions. What we regulate are emissions at the source in Quebec. So it's the fact of burning 1 liter of gas in your car, or burning 1 liter of diesel to operate a generator or equipment. Businesses are responsible for covering those emissions and paying a carbon cost for those emissions. As part of the pipeline project, it's transportation of crude oil. No greenhouse gas emissions take place. And most of the questions that I'm hearing come rather from the emissions linked with the extraction of that oil, which happens outside Quebec. In our regulations, we cover only greenhouse gas emissions in Quebec. What is the price of 1 ton of CO2 that would be required to modify behaviors? Well, it will depend. Currently, we have a price of close to $13 US, or 17 to 18 Canadian dollars per ton. There are some actions taken in terms of energy efficiency that pay in the short term with a negative cost because they lead to savings. At $17 a ton, savings can be made. If we talk about carpooling or changing your car, it could pay at $17 a ton, depending on the number of kilometers you drive. If we talk about changing industrial equipment that need millions in terms of equipment, maybe $17 is not enough as an incentive. Maybe it would take more. It depends a lot on the different sectors of activity and the marginal reduction cost that each of these sectors is coping with. I understand that very well. But do you still have the impression that in the last 2 years, at the current price of carbon, do you have the feeling that there is the beginning of a movement so that it actually becomes an incentive? It might be a subjective impression only, or people said you just add that as a cost and that's it. I would tell you it's just a feeling or an impression right now. After 2 years of implementation, we don't yet have the data to really do the analyses to tell you whether or not there are any statistically significant trends. What I can see is that yes, people do take into account the carbon cost. They realize that their actions had an impact, an environmental impact, and we associated a cost with that. In terms of businesses and new projects, that's taken into account, and I'm very optimistic that a change is on its way. At least that's what I perceive subjectively, and we will really be able to confirm that in the next few years. Mr. Germain? My question is for Mr. Nollet. Recently, we saw in newspaper articles that people were talking that international aviation should become carbon neutral. If we see the roundtable referring to $300 a ton, a carbon tax at $300 a ton, we know that flights from Paris to Montreal and return several hundreds of kilograms of greenhouse gases are emitted. So that would be carbon taxes of hundreds of dollars that would be added to the price of your plane ticket, Quebec, Montreal. But the very concept that we saw recently, what does it mean that aviation would be carbon neutral? When you know that they would have hundreds of dollars of taxes on aviation fuel, on aviation companies. Normally, what we mean by that is the idea that overall, globally, we will organize so that travel should be carbon neutral. So either it doesn't emit any greenhouse gas emissions, or these greenhouse gas emissions are compensated by other reductions elsewhere. So when you tell me that it could cost a couple of $100 more if there are a carbon tax of $300, for example, a transatlantic flight Quebec to Paris is 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions per passenger. So in that case, that could translate into $300 additional for tickets, indeed. Does that answer your question? Yes. So the concept of carbon neutral for aviation, is a short deadline, 2020. That would mean that there would be taxes of several hundreds of dollars that would be added to the plane tickets to go to the South or to go to Europe. I don't have the newspaper article in mind, but in principle, it could mean that. It could mean that. Okay, thank you. Ms. Grandpois, I just wanted to come back and conclude with my follow-up to Mr. Brulman's question. Mr. Nollet, would you have a comment on your subjective opinion? We understand that this is very, very vague. It's a matter of opinions and impressions because nobody has the answer to that question. But the price of carbon that would be required to lead to major changes in the behaviors of businesses and major changes that would allow us to reach the international objectives for greenhouse gas reductions for you, what kind of order of magnitude would be in terms of dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent? It's a very good question. It's not easy to answer, especially because since concretely, as Mr. Bergeron was referring to earlier, the evolution of the price of the barrel of oil has a big impact. Very often, it's cumulative impacts that will allow us to have the choice not to produce or to produce. Concretely speaking, currently in Alberta, there's a lot more impact associated with the drop in the price of the barrel rather than the carbon taxes. So there are strategic choices that are made by companies in their choice of producing or not producing. As I illustrated a bit earlier, in the current context with an oil price at $40 per barrel U.S., whereas even for old facilities that have amortized their costs, just the production cost, the average production cost is around $30 to $40 U.S. Well, the $2 more per ton right now that is charged in Alberta due to carbon does have an impact. There is a definite impact, and then other factors have to be taken into account. To answer your question, is the sector of activity in which you are, and then what competitors are doing also. If all competitors are doing the same, then being impacted by an additional carbon cost, well, it's easier to pass it through to consumers, and then everybody in the industry will adopt more or less similar behaviors, and we will be less impacted individually. In the opposite case, when you're the only jurisdiction to impose on yourself an additional cost, then indeed there is a variation due to this additional carbon cost, and that could have a greater impact. An interesting point when we compare the Albertan approach compared to the Quebec approach, as Mr. Benoit noted, is that in the Quebec framework, there is a cap on emissions. That's what will dictate the price, the market price for carbon. So in Quebec, we make sure that we'll reach a clearly defined objective in physical terms, in terms of annual greenhouse gases emitted annually. And then we let the market determine the price it takes to get there. So concretely, in the Quebec framework, we know that the price that we have on the market is sufficient to reach the objectives we've adopted, because it's the result of the quantitative standard we've adopted. And the Albertan framework is different because they haven't given themselves any map for the moment. I find this interesting. You answered a question that I had kept for later. If you just want to continue or elaborate a bit more, in the case of Quebec, what you just said essentially is that Quebec has given itself some objectives, and with its SPEDE system, its cap and trade system, exchange capping system, they would normally be able to, Quebec would normally be able to achieve its objectives. In the case of Alberta, there is a carbon tax, but it does not automatically mean that the objectives, the numbered objectives, or whenever they're specified, it doesn't mean that those objectives will be reached, even if there's a carbon tax. Is that okay to say so? Or could you clarify if it's not correct? You're absolutely right. In the Quebec framework, and here I'm encroaching on the expertise of Mr. Benoit Côté, but it's mechanical, it's automatic. We establish a cap, then we distribute emission rights in different ways, and the players on the market can exchange those rights at the price they consider that makes sense in view of the constraints that are imposed on them. So we make sure we achieve the objective, and we let the market set the price then. In Alberta, there's nothing like that for the moment. So as I mentioned, in Alberta, we have not selected to adopt an objective in terms of tons of greenhouse gases per year. We chose rather to put a quote-unquote tax, and that tax, we don't know what result it gives. That's the main difference between actually, economists talk a lot about the usefulness of putting a price on carbon to be an incentive for behavior changes. There are two types of ways that are used to give a price to carbon. At the basis, there's a tax, that's one way, or a cap and trade system like in Quebec. And it is generally agreed that with the cap, we make sure that we will achieve the environmental objective. But with the tax, we make sure that we control the impact on businesses. So we make sure that we'll not disturb the economic life of businesses too much, but up to the level that we choose by the tax without knowing what environmental impact we'll have. I don't know if I'm clear. Yes, I think so. And so it means that when we talk about international commitments, the Quebec system, Mr. Benoit, is a system which is recognized. And so with that, people who produce more and they buy credits to compensate or offset at an auction or whatever, then it's recognized internationally. So if Quebec had a reduction objective of so much, and part of this is obtained through credits, it's recognized. In the case of Alberta, if I understand correctly, if they had an objective of reducing by X%, if they don't achieve their objective, well, the fact that they taxed, I'm not too sure. Can you tell me whether it's the case they will stop? Here we're talking about environmental integrity. The cap-and-trade systems, like Mr. Nollet said, are based first and foremost on establishing ceilings and caps were established in such a way as to achieve our reduction objective. It's true for Quebec, it's true for California. We have linked our systems together. We can exchange the permits that we've issued. The cap is the number of emission rights that we will put in circulation for a given year, the number of emission rights outstanding, and we reduce that number from year to year so as to limit the emissions by companies. So if it costs in Quebec, we said 20% under 1990 in 2020, it means reducing to respect that costs $100, well, the price on the market will be $100. If it costs $20 to reduce that last ton, the price on the market will be $20. In Alberta, they say we impose a carbon cost, a $20 or $30 tax. Theoretically, based on the economic analysis, it should give us so much reduction, but we're not sure. So we impose a carbon tax, we put a price on carbon, and we look the economy, what the market is doing. Maybe people will continue to pay simply. If the last ton to be reduced is $100 and the tax is $20, well, they will prefer to pay $20 per ton. They will prefer to pay the carbon tax. So that tax does not guarantee that the environmental objective will be achieved, contrary to the cap-and-trade system. It's very clear. Thank you, Mr. Benoit. Mr. Germain? From what I understand, in the system, you have a floor price, too. That's to avoid, as we saw in Chicago, I can't remember the word, where at the exchange it went down to 10 cents. So you want to make sure that it should go down. You want to avoid any depression in the prices. Yes, it's really to avoid a depression. It's really also to send this signal. It comes back to to what Mr. Nille was saying. Let's look at the European market. The first phase, they put rights in place. The price went up to 30 euros. Then there was a recession, and there were some measures that were implemented that were such that companies still reduced their emissions. The reductions were faster than anticipated, with the result that there were too many emission rights in their system, and the price dropped to a few euro cents. In the second phase, it went up to some 20 euros. It went back down to 5. Then it went up to 10, 12. It went back down to 8. We saw the same thing elsewhere. What we wanted to do, we wanted to make sure to keep a minimum price and to send a signal to the industry. I'll come back to what I said at the beginning. The goal of the system is to send a price signal to the industry to modify the behavior of companies. Since the system is in place, when a company makes an investment project, they will look at its operating costs, the cost to carry out the project, the income arising from the project, but they also have to take into account the carbon cost. So the emission rights that they will have to purchase, or the emission rights that they could sell if their project allows them to reduce emissions compared to what they were before. The company will take into consideration the carbon cost in the decision to have the project or not, if and only if we guarantee that there will be a stable price in the medium and long term. No company will risk investing billions with a carbon price that goes up to 30 euros, goes back down to 0, goes up to 20, and goes back down to 2. So that minimum floor price allows us to give some assurance to companies that they can make the right investment, they can make the right choice, and that they will be able to have some profitability. Or, as the case may be, instead of using obsolete and old equipment that are less energy efficient, well, the cost for them will be more and more important over the years. So it's in your interest to use a more effective or more energy efficient equipment. Our minimum price increases by 5% plus inflation every year. So it's really a strong long-term signal that we're sending. However, in your explanation earlier, there is a floor price, but there is no ceiling price. There's one thing in your explanation that concerns me. For example, if we have a sector for export companies, for example, you say we don't want to penalize them. Let's say there's an export business that is expanding, and they could have free credits then. However, that, if I understood you correctly, it wouldn't change the overall cap set by Quebec. From what I understand, then it would mean that the other sectors in the Quebec economy should support that increase due to exports. Am I off field, or is that the right interpretation? Absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. The ceiling we set is an overall ceiling for the whole economy of Quebec. Now that we're linked with California, it's a global ceiling for both Quebec and California. we are not limiting each company in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. We limit the collectivity. We limit that collectively. If a company emits one more ton, it's not because a company emits one more ton that we will put more rights in circle outstanding. So each ton emitted by Mr. Nollet have to be reduced by me, and the market then will determine if it costs less for Mr. Nollet to reduce. Should he reduce? Unless he's the cheapest, I will reduce. So in that case, companies that will increase their production to do exports, for example, very often it's because they can get easy reductions in their business, and they will choose to pay someone that will reduce emissions in their place. In terms of the global overall economy, we're winners because we achieve the same environmental objective with lower collective costs. Thank you, Mr. Brodmans. Mr. President, just a brief comment. The cap-and-trade system, I don't think it works. We have no proof and evidence that it works correctly. We'll see at these Soul Canyons, there was emission of several megatons in California. We'll see if that will be reflected in the next auctions here in Quebec. I'm really anxious to see that. I also want to thank the Commission and the Commissioner to pursue and continue the ideas that are expressed by the various people in the microphone. It's my turn to thank you for your ideas, Mr. Brillmans. We will now take a break, and I would like to inform you that the registration lists are now closed. Mr. President, after the break, I will table some documents, but I can offer you the response on the Alberta government now at your discretion. Okay, go ahead. Very quickly, I was confirmed that the government of Alberta still intends to ship 100,000 barrels a day on Energy East, but the government doesn't own any oil. Thank you. So let's be back here in 15 minutes.
Messieurs, dames, si vous voulez prendre place, nous poursuivons immédiatement notre questionnement.
We will continue now and resume our session, ladies and gentlemen.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Bergeron, you wanted to table a few documents. Mr. President, I'd like to table 7 documents. The first one being the source of information. This is for chart 7.1, table 7.1. The second one, railway incident analysis to indicate if the average incidence, volume 6, if it's specific to the transportation of hazardous material. The answer is for all of the railway activities, and a commitment in regards to the risks linked with the earthquakes. I'm showing you the first part of the answer. And information in regards to the railway proximity, answering Mr. Benoit Chevalier's question regarding the pipelines, the pipeline along the railway. Another answer, answering Ms. Grandbois' question regarding the bank kilometers that would be impacted along the HMA River, 3.8 kilometers upstream, 3.44 kilometers downstream. A commitment then regarding the promoter's clarification relating to exhibit numbers in regards to fish catching and habitat and the species of interest for fishing and Aboriginals fishing, and the Fraser Institute report safety in the transportation of oil and gas, pipeline or rail. That's the title of the document. I would like to add 4 other numbers for your information, Commissioners. Mr. Laporte from the BST said that there was TSB. There was no comparative analysis. That this was very complex because of the risk factors, which differ greatly. And Mr. Laporte's presentation was about spills. I'd like to give you some information. Additional information to the Commission, not on the spills, but on the accidents that can create an explosion or a fire. We know, for example, that the average crude oil volume transported by rail 2014-15 was 150,000 barrels per day. And we can talk about the 3 events, Plaster Rock and 2 in Gogama in February and March 2015, those events which resulted in explosions and fires. Considering pipelines, the average volume transported was 3.8 million barrels per day in 2014. 50 years ago, we didn't find any event which led to a fire or an explosion on a pipeline. This completes information. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Marcel Lemieux in La Pocatière. All right. Madame Carole Dupuis in Lévis.
Bonjour, Madame.
Good afternoon, Madam. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Madam Commissioner, Mr. Commissioner. My question is about the lateral lines. I mean, they were run up somehow this morning with Mr. Guilbeault's presentation, but I'd like to come back to the precise question. There is a mystery for me and for many citizens, because Suncor in Montreal, they process 137,000 barrels per day, and they can't be happy with a pipeline which provides them in 300,000 barrels per day, which is the Enbridge 9B line. So why do they need 1.1 million barrels? So nobody can answer my question here, but I'd like to address it, and I'd like to see if the Commission can find answers on that. 2 things. Firstly, the item that was raised by Mr. Guilbeault this morning, could there be a link between this and an eventual port in Montreal? The fact that this lateral line exists, would this facilitate a possible application before the NEB or a possible change of plans for TransCanada? Maybe not, but for the oil shippers. Levy, it's about the same thing slightly, but again, this is an assumption. My real question, hence, is about the plant that Suncor has in the plans for many years. This was raised recently, some rumors. People are talking about that. Is there any link? Are there any projects for rehabilitation? Why does Suncor need so much oil, 1.4 million barrels near its door, because of this coking project, while they process 137,000 per day? Is there a link with the Montreal facilities? Is there a link here with coking? We know that Petcoke is a producer of very significant amounts of GHGs. And so you've admitted this yourself. You're fully aware of that. The company's not here, right? So the commission can examine the question. And if we decide to keep it, then we can address the question. And this will be sent to Suncor. And we'll entertain it. I'd like to ask Mr. Bergeron, are there any interesting matters that, or things that we can say broadly to Madam while we decide whether or not we should intervene with Suncor? Mr. President, I'd like to talk about what's been said before. Having an alternative for Enbridge would be, strategically speaking, very important and interesting. That's what was said, and thank you, Madam. Mr. Denis Desmeules in the room here.
Bonjour, monsieur.
D'abord, hier, j'avais la question concernant la comparaison des coûts entre Kalamazoo et les chemins. Est-ce que M. Bergeron avait parlé, là, qui regarderait la ventilation des coûts de Kalamazoo pour faire un comparatif? Est-ce qu'on va avoir cette information-là de votre côté, M. le Président?
C'est sûr que M. Bergeron, que le promoteur doit déposer l'information comme il s'est engagé à le faire. Maintenant, je viens juste de lui demander s'il avait des informations nouvelles.
J'ai entendu la réponse.
Maintenant, celle-ci n'y était pas.
Okay.
Donc, je présume que ça va venir un peu plus tard.
D'accord. Une question complémentaire. Complémentaire, je pense qu'on n'a pas abordé le sujet. On parle d'un débit de 1,1 million. La question est...
The question is very technical. Can we push the flow so that it can be brought back to 1.4, 1.5, 1.6? We're talking about barrels per day. So that's the maximum and not 1.1, because if we calculate 1.1 million barrels everywhere, if everybody asks for that along the way, of course, we need more than that, more than 1.1 barrels that will need to be there in Alberta, storage there, because if everybody orders it, this can go easily beyond 1.1 million. Is that the maximum floor, or can this this go beyond the amount? Mr. DeMille's question allows me to clarify what I've said last week. Last week, I gave you some examples, the downstream factors. Do you remember that? These were performance factors that we could anticipate on the pipelines. My background as an operator of pipelines of 250 kilometers, because of that, I came up with 98% figures, while my colleagues reminded me that a pipeline of 4,500 kilometers, that was different in terms of percentage. 1.25 million barrels per day, and we have the factor of 88% factor, we get the result of 1.1 million barrels per day. The whole mechanic design was done in view of 1.25 million barrels per day. I'm referring here to the scenarios where the line would be totally ruptured, the valves, the location, and so on. Everything was considered 1.25, but a pipeline with 71 pump station and of 4,500 kilometers, we need to consider the performance factor. If things go well, we could go up to 1.25 million barrels. Is that what you're saying? Theoretically, 1.25. Theoretically and practically, because what, 88%? Mr. President, I asked a question in-house. I wanted to know, we were given the example for Keystone. What's the percentage of the time that we could reach the maximum? I didn't get the answer still, but I can give it to you later. Thank you. I think that what's important for Mr. Demel, your concern was to know if everything was planned for, if the design, if the impacts were made in view of the maximum volume that could flow through the pipeline. Mr. Bergeron seems to say that the maximum is 1.25, and everything was designed in view of 1.25 millions of barrels per day. 1.25 million barrels per day. Thank you. Mr. Luc Falardeau, Laval. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Falardeau. I have a comment to make regarding the lateral, Montreal. I could even be considered as an expert resource on that side for the petrochemical Montreal East region. Is that an offer that you're making publicly to the Commission? Well, go ahead, sir. Yes. Okay, go ahead. After exploring in great details all the geography east of Montreal in regards to pipelines and railways for all the oil docks that exist currently. Until the 70s, they supplied different or many refineries in Montreal. These docks are still there. For the Suncor refinery, there are different ways to supply the refinery. Or rather, a railway supply can be provided for the refinery. It could be supplied through ports. This is a crude oil supply through its maritime terminal, and other docks nearby can be used also. So it's mentioned that Suncor, they want to add some flexibility, if I understand things correctly. They already have that flexibility for supply purposes, and the refinery has only 15%. Only 15% of maximum has reached only 50% of its maximal capacity, which is 135,000 barrels per day. Only 20,000 barrels per day, compared with a huge pipe, which has huge capacity. There's only a small capacity like that, which seems to be quite surprising, at least slightly. My question now. Well, unfortunately, there's the absence of the promoters or behind the Energy project. There's Suncor, refiner, shipper, and so on, and their absence also before the Commission's session. But I have to specify, except one session at the beginning on the first Tuesday. Besides that, they were not there. And each project is treated one by one. Big projects, but small by small, little by little, those projects are dealt with without citizens being able to have the order of magnitude. With all the details that could be grafted on the project: refinery, railway, shipping, or by ships, railway, transportation. So my question: is it possible to reach the objective of limiting to 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of climate change? But this would be, we would go beyond that level, according to a Queensland scientist in Australia. His study was published a few days ago in The Guardian in Great Britain. So it would be impossible to do that. When the world population increases and the consumption per inhabitant in Asia, notably, threatens all the anticipated gains, positive gains to reduce the intensity of emissions per barrel. The intensity per barrel. So we're working on low gain percentages. So it seems that the only way not to speed up that trend would be to significantly limit the quantities produced in Canada yearly. Now the question. Experts from the different environmental departments, can they design modeling scenarios for the emissions of greenhouse gas, greenhouse gas emission in order to reach our goal, which is to limit the temperature increase 2 degrees Celsius, a scenario based on stopping exports of crude oil coming from oil sands. This is not ludicrous. In the United States, they did it for 40 years. Between 75 at the oil crisis time until January 2016, a few weeks ago. Since the oil crisis up to 2016, they created a reserve, and thanks to that, they were able to develop their refining industry for all those years. Now it's mature. And so the question is simply, are there any experts that could do these modeling designs or have done those designs towards advancing the towards stopping the exports of crude oil? You have talked extensively about the thematic approach for the Commission. The Commission said it was relevant to continue with its approach, which is by themes, because the number of experts and resource people that would have been required day after day in order to cover all of the topics, depending on the various questions that might have been submitted to the Commission, this would have been unrealistic. So that's why I wanted to stress that for clarification purposes. You've seen that. You've attended the proceedings of the Commission. You've seen how many experts, how many resource people. The same thing for the promoter. They had their own resource people. And so for us, it was the only way to proceed, to proceed with different teams. Now, I would like to ask the people from Resources Canada to ask this question about modeling. This is related to Mr. Bonin's question earlier. He asked if there had been any modeling scenarios or different assumptions about the extraction of oil in oil sands. Anyway, we can't answer this question right now, but we'll be informed through the department to see if we don't have any experts that have knowledge about that, or if we could find some references to give you. And you'll answer in writing? Yes, in writing next week. Thank you. Very well. Ms. Gambois. Mr. Bergeron, I'd like to come back to the question that Mr. Falardeau has covered. At the beginning of, I don't know, I don't dare repeat his question, but at the beginning of his intervention. Okay, as many attendees, he talked about, again, the lateral in Montreal. Now, again, myself, well, could you come back on that? Because we understand that in Quebec, if we say that Valero will benefit from an increased flexibility, there's a lateral of, I don't know what the distance is. It's not too long, right? So it's easy to imagine and understand that. Moreover, they're not immediately near, or they're not glued to the pipeline. For Suncor, we're talking about a lateral that's way more way longer. It crosses 2 rivers. It has a higher cost. That lateral costs more. You said that you had agreement with Suncor. I must admit that this is not easy to understand because the pipeline is present and there's the Enbridge 9B pipeline. And because of the cost of the lateral, it's true that it's not an easy task to understand. Why is it so worthwhile to have such a lateral to give an increased flexibility to Suncor if there are no other projects nearby on the location? You said you had an agreement with Suncor on certain volumes. Does that agreement deal with cost sharing for the lateral? Is there anything you want to say about that? Indeed, this is an issue, a stake that Suncor could address perhaps more. There are costs related to the Suncor lateral, 42 inches, 16 kilometers crossing 2 rivers, one with a 70-meter deep drilling under the Des Prairies River. This is not small. This might look simplistic. That's not the case. But if there's a producer or a refiner that asks us to have a connection let's say their refiner, for example, asks us to create on both sides a connection. Our rates, our cost, our commercial structure do reflect that situation indeed. So the costs for the lateral must be amortized with the tariff, the rate that would be paid by Suncor. Again, we are entering commercial discussions, which are quite sensitive. Honestly, I think that Suncor has the answer. They really know what the answer is, way more than us. So let's say there's a shipper. There's a shipper that tells us, okay, I want to bring to St. John, New Brunswick, 150,000 barrels. The logistics is done accordingly. We know that that capacity must be available for that specific shipper. As I said earlier, I cannot disclose all the details regarding volumes and who is going to transport what. So I understand that there are questions, and I think that the only entity that can provide answers is Suncor. Then we'll see what happens. But you're an organization and you're in business, and if you've included the line, it's because you've presupposed that you have the guarantees that are good enough in order to recover the investments. The commercial agreements are a reflection of the costs. Yes. Mr. Farado, thank you. Mr. Denis Gauthier in Trois-Rivières. Mr. Gauthier, we're talking about a huge topic, the greenhouse gas, GHG. I looked slightly at this. I have 5 grandchildren. I have to think about their future, if ever they will get one. Now, I've tried to anticipate the future for my kids, my grandchildren, to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. We have to learn from the past somehow, to see what happened in the past. For example, the massive extinctions that occurred. There have been many documentaries on that. I could name you a few, but during the great extinctions, the massive ones, this was all related to climate change. I'll read something. Acidification of oceans, what we face today. Loss of reef, as we know. Climate change, climate extremes, the disasters that we've seen, that occurred in the past during the extinction phases, extinguishment phases. The climate refugees. I think that there are 800,000 people. I think it's more than that, more than during the wartime, war period. You know, in those times, in the horrid past, animals had those problems, and now it's human being. Acidification of water, we're facing that problem. So, food safety, the farming performance. I have a diploma in agriculture. Agriculture is something very important for me. So the agricultural returns, if we go over 2 degrees, we will face huge problems. In 2012, we saw it in the La Semaine Verte show on TV. We saw it that there's a huge percentage of agricultural losses in the United States. This could represent a huge devastation. I mean, when you go beyond 2 degrees. Pollution now. Now we won't beat around the bush. I suffer from asthma. I've lost 40% of my lung capacity. If the smog levels would be too high, I couldn't be here to talk about it. Now the water levels being too high because of glaciation or not on the seas and so on. By and large, this gives you an idea of what will happen in the future, perhaps. There's the ice period also short one. I've read about it. An increase by 2 degrees created a mortality of one-third of the world population died. And also famine. Your question? I want you to understand a few things. My question. Look at this beautiful picture. You can find it on the web. This is from NASA. This is the ozone hole because of the vicious circle in which we are. Beautiful colors, right? In the 70s, this is based in the 70s. The question was about that. Mr. Gauthier, there's the 0 point. And if we go towards 1985, you have to talk about you have to address a question. You know what? I don't come often here, so that's why I'm asking for perhaps a little bit more time. This won't take too much time. Yes, but let's try to be faster. We broke records in 2011, 25 million kilometers. Mr. Gauthier, you asked me something that I cannot do, honestly. This has nothing to do with the frequency of your participation, your attendance. We have to be fair with everybody. I am extremely tolerant as a president. Many people have seen it. But now you have a very long-winded, very long speech. So the ozone hole, and on the environmental side, I don't know if they've been follow-ups on that, but NASA has a monthly monitoring process, and they monitor the ozone layer. I don't know if they have that, but now what happens is that we have to butter up our kids with solar sun protection cream, and then they have to wear hats and all that, and the environment is important. Yes, sir, yes, indeed, but I'd like to have an answer from the Department of the Environment. Have you started some studies on the ozone layer? We're talking about the ozone, the stratospheric ozone layer, and not the other one. I would have to check if we have a follow-up or a monitoring process that started on that. I asked the question to the Department of the Environment, the Quebec Department, because the people from the federal government at the Environmental Department are not here. So they are the ones in charge of such a study usually. So I've accepted the question because somehow it's linked with the greenhouse gas emissions, even if it's even though it's from if it is so at a distance. Mr. Prévost in Trois-Rivières now, you have the floor. Mr. Prévost, good evening. Good evening, Mr. Zayed. My question is a little bit direct. It's rare that I face such direct questions. Will TransCanada modify the pipeline route near my home at Saint-Étienne-des-Grès, where the municipal council refuses that crossing? I want a clear yes and no answer. Will they modify the route? Mr. Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président, je vais demander à M. St-Laurent de répondre.
Mr. President, I will ask Mr. St-Laurent to answer the question.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, We looked at this because Mr. Provost already shared his concerns with us. We looked into the possibility in this sector of Saint-Étienne-des-Grès, and in view of various constraints in this sector, for the moment, there are no plans to modify the route. That was explained to the municipality of Saint-Étienne-des-Grès. Discussions will still continue, but for the moment, the route that we propose is really the one that we think has the least impact. So it's quite interesting because finally, we change from theory to practice. We have a typical case, and this week and tonight we'll talk about the type of negotiations that TransCanada and the Energy East pipeline has with owners. In a case like this one, what is the alternative, or what are the options remaining now to Mr. Provost if ever there's no agreement? There's a whole process with the board, but before getting to the board, yeah, that's what I want. I wanted to get there first. Yes, I wanted to explain what I attempted to explain a bit earlier this week. We have large variations of routes that we study, and gradually we get closer to a more and more finalized route. As I mentioned the other night, it's never final as long as the construction has not started. So we can make adjustments, and this happened in previous projects where we made several adjustments. Even after getting all the permits, we still made some adjustments because we had opportunities for improvements. Of course, if we take lot by lot, plot by plot, there are issues, constraints, concerns, and clearly if we were to ask each landowner about the ideal route, we couldn't make a decision from one place to another, so we have to optimize and conduct a more comprehensive study by region. In this specific case here, what I understand that there's been quite a lot of work in terms of inventories, wooded lots, marshes, swamps, bogs, the different areas, distances from houses and buildings, and we try to find the least impact route. Now, discussions can still continue, and the objective is to come with the least impact route, always being aware that there are always impacts. This is an ongoing process. It's a discussion process. And from experience, I can tell you that I've seen situations where we had the feeling that we were in an impasse, and we did find a solution. So if we talk to each other, if we continue to exchange and discuss, we can always improve the project. There will always be impacts, but we can minimize them. Have you continued to exchange with Mr. Provost? I don't have the content of the last discussions or the dates of the last discussions, but as I also said earlier this week, the company voluntarily chose to reduce its field activities with owners because we have a lot of previous steps to go through. I talked to you about an agreement with the Union of Agricultural Producers. There was the BAP. There's the Agricultural Protection Commission. So we chose to reduce our efforts at that level and finish our homework, as some people asked us to do. Then we can resume discussions with landowners. And the exact location of the route and mitigation measures, it's always part of the discussions. It's one of the topics on which we can spend 3, 4, 5, 6 meetings when necessary. So, of course, this is a long process. There's no doubt about it. It's got to be done with exchanges on both sides. But I can tell you that the company has invested a lot of efforts to really document very well all the characteristics of each of the properties, and that's what we work with. But we have to continue to discuss with the owners. Mr. Zayed? Yes, I would have a sub-question. Just a moment, Mr. Provost. Mr. Provost, since you're the last speaker, I will accept your sub-question. Thank you. You said earlier this afternoon about the distance between a gas pipeline and an oil pipeline close to my residence, close to my lot, where the answer supposedly is no, they won't change the route. There is a gas pipeline present, and the distance between the gas pipeline and the oil pipeline is 12 inches. 12 inches, 30 centimeters under the oil pipeline will go under the gas pipeline. This information comes from Mr. Veilleux, whom I met on June 29th, 2015 at 10 o'clock a.m. It's very specific, the information they gave me. I asked TransCanada in writing to have my water analyzed every 2 years. They refused. When I asked them in writing, I will have to taste the water, see if it tastes like oil in order to have it tested. Mr. Zayed, I would like you to make a recommendation on that, having the water analyzed as an obligation by TransCanada if they pass close to my residence, and the danger of a gas pipeline just 12 inches underground from an oil pipeline under it. I think it's important enough to talk about it. It's at the junction of highways 55 north of Three River. No, north of Trois-Rivières. I would like to inform you, Mr. Provost, that all the words that were said here during the first part of the hearings, as well as during the second part of the hearings, the Commission will read all the transcripts, will analyze them, and will give to it the follow-up that seems the most appropriate. Now, I'd like to come back with a question that intrigued me. Is the distance between the gas pipeline and the oil pipeline eventually be of what? Mr. President, I will ask Mr. St-Laurent to explain. In this case, Mr. Provost is talking about a gas metro pipe, which is along Highway 55. So we are going to cross that gas pipe. And to cross it, we can't go several meters away. But since we're both crossing Highway 55 at the same time, we'll do a horizontal drilling. And the distance, although the code requires a minimum of 30 centimeters between two pipes of that size, will be a lot higher, will be higher than that because the drilling will be a lot lower. But currently, the detailed engineering has not been made, so I can't give you the exact distance, but in order of magnitude, it's going to be probably 1 meter, probably 1.5 meter. But this is just when we cross another line. We can't go in terrible depths, but it will be under the gas pipeline, the gas distribution pipe for Gas Metro, by about 1 or 1.5 meters under it. Thank you, Mr. Provost. I will now give the floor to my colleague, Ms. Gisèle Grandbois. Let's come back to the greenhouse gases. I would have a question for Mr. Benoit. As was mentioned earlier, the Energy East pipeline project, during its operation, during the transportation, when the transportation of the oil by pipeline has started, if the project happens, we're talking about limited greenhouse gas emissions because the pumping stations would work with hydroelectricity. So we're talking about 2,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year based on the promoter's data. However, during construction, there will be clearly more substantial emissions given the scope of the work. Just in Quebec, just for the Quebec portion, and this is according to promoters' data, just for the Quebec portion, we're talking about 84,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And since the project will be spread out over 2 years and a half, they give a total of 215,000 tons of CO2 equivalent during the whole construction period for all the construction work in Quebec. My question for you, Mr. Benoit, I think that the SPD, your program, your cap-and-trade program, doesn't apply to construction programs, but we'd like to hear you on that. Is that something that's coming? Could it apply to construction projects? We talk about the usual construction projects. Of course, emissions can be relatively modest, but in this case, it's rather substantial because the reporting threshold is 25,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. So at 84,000 per year or 215,000 for the whole project, we're talking about substantial emissions. So could it be subject to the cap-and-trade? The system aims to cover. I'm just trying to popularize, I would say, in two different ways. We cover companies in two different ways, either directly for emissions at the source, for example, a cement factory or a refinery or a pulp and paper plant that produces paper in order to produce cement, that they may produce paper, cement, aluminum, and emit greenhouse gas emissions at the chimney. So we then cover the facility as such. Building the pipeline, we're not subjecting directly the construction of a pipeline. This being said, since January 1st, 2015, we also cover distributors of fuel in Quebec. So all the gas stations and all the gasoline or diesel used to heat up buildings is covered at the distributor's level, which then transfers the carbon to its customers. I have not looked exactly where those 84,000 tons a year came from, or those 215,000 tons in total for the project, but I get the feeling that the vast majority of that comes from the trucks that will be in different places on the site. In the context that this is on Quebec territory, it's Quebec gas or diesel that will be bought. It is already indirectly covered by the system through the distributors. They will have a carbon tax at the filling rate, $17 a ton, that will be transferred to the promoter. Thank you. It's very clear. And I understand also, I just want you to confirm that so that I'm 100% sure. I understand also that the crude oil, which will be transported by pipeline, is not covered, since it is covered during refining if it goes through Quebec. But if it doesn't goes through Quebec, it might be covered or not, depending on its final destination and its final use. Quite correct. Absolutely. Okay, thank you. Now, I would have a question for Mr. Nollet regarding the changes in Alberta with the carbon tax. I read the information about that, but quickly, I must confess that I was a bit confused when I looked at the information regarding the moment from which the oil sands operations will really become subject to the system. Can you tell me whether hydrocarbon production activities, in particular oil production activities from the oil sands, are they subject to the carbon tax in 2017 or 2023? I hesitate here. If we talk about operation, extraction, yes, surface extraction or in situ extraction, they're already covered as long as the company emits more than 100,000 tons a year. That's the threshold which determines whether the facility is covered or not. And there was a text, actually, that, so you confirmed that they are already covered. The difference is that tax will eventually increase. As I said, they're already covered as long as they have more than 100,000. That's clear. Yes, more than 100,000. Okay. I would have a question of a more general nature. We talked a lot about the whole issue of the Paris Agreement, the main international objectives to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under 2% and at a maximum of 1.5%. We talked a lot about the efforts required that are expected, reduction efforts that are expected from businesses. We didn't talk a lot about consumers' efforts, and eventually so that there is less production of certain products. If there are still buyers, of course, that's an incentive to produce more. So I would like to hear you about the question of behavior modification. We talked about modifying the behavior of businesses. Now, modifying individuals' behaviors. We know that that's also a long-term process. We know that people talk a lot about that. The fact that so many people took part in our BAP hearings is certainly an indication of the fact that several people are very, very aware. But we also observe at the same time things like the percentage of passenger vehicles in Quebec, the percentage of those that are SUVs, that has increased considerably in the last few years. Of course, these vehicles are now more energy efficient, but they still consume more than very, very small cars. No, so in terms of behavior modifications of the citizens, I would like to hear you, Mr. Benoit, Mr. Nollet, what does it how is it affected? What does it go through exactly? Quickly, at various points. The first one is the implementation of the cap-and-trade system. By doing that, we send a signal, a carbon cost across the economy, and now also with the general citizens in the street, because we cover all fuels, all types of fuels. The cap-and-trade system from now until 2020 will generate a bit more than $3 billion, which will be entirely reinvested in the fight against climate change. The first thing to do in Quebec, 45% of our emissions come from the transportation sector. This is the sector of activity that we have to address and on which we have to work. The $3 billion, the $3.3 billion that the Quebec government will invest in the fight against climate change from now until 2020, two-thirds of those amounts are dedicated to transportation, financing public transit, collective transportation, alternative transportation modes, more buses on the road, better quality of public transit and collective transport in general. Another thing that is done by the government of Quebec is to work on the electrification of transportation. There's a whole network of recharge areas, and there's interesting measures for the purchase of electric vehicles. Our electricity doesn't emit a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, so it pays in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to pass to electric vehicles. The government has a plan, and we work a lot in this regard with that purpose. Also in Quebec, we already have the vast majority of the houses that are heated up with electricity, which is a non-greenhouse gas emitting source of energy. The fact remains that part of the houses are still heated up with natural gas or heavy fuel. There are energy efficiency programs that were put in place to help citizens and companies, SMEs and shops in general, to become more efficient and to reduce their energy consumption in general, so their greenhouse gas emissions. It's not always easy to speak after Mr. Benoit. Actually, one of the points I could mention as a compliment, which deserves to be mentioned, is that one way for the governments to intervene is sometimes through regulations. And what we've seen, for example, happening in California was the adoption of what is called the low fuel standard, which forces there's two things, actually. We can force the use of biofuels, for example, in gas, so that the same gas consumption will generate less greenhouse gases, but we can force efficiency gains by the automobile manufacturers, and part of the automotive fleet could become electric. So aiming at the consumer directly sometimes is difficult. We talk a lot in terms of the interest of imposing a price on carbon, but sometimes carbon price would need to be very high in order to have a real impact on consumers. So we have to come with complementary measures, such as regulations in certain cases, which will not necessarily force the consumer himself or herself, but will force distributors and product designers to offer something else to consumers to come to interesting results. And through complementary programs such as the ones mentioned by Mr. Benoit, we have to offer alternatives to consumers. The price incentive is an important point, but the consumer also has to have access to alternatives so as to change their behaviors. So sometimes it means emphasizing something else apart from greenhouse gas emissions. It could mean urban planning done in a different way so that it's more interesting to live in environmentally healthy districts, town districts, or it may mean in certain situations that we could encourage in cities, for example, a different type of life, local life in boroughs or districts. So people who live in the same city district might share vehicles, share electric vehicles, and so on. And then we modify ways of doing things by making it interesting through the creation of a different dynamic in a city district, for example. I know that it may seem very long-term, but those are concrete things on which we're working. You spoke about the use of biofuels. correct me if I'm wrong, but the information I got on that is such that the political agendas in the world were apparently substantially modified in the last few years. There were percentages of ethanol, 5% or 10%. In Europe, it was 10 or even 15%. Apparently, those policies have been substantially amended because life cycle studies apparently demonstrated that the only biofuel that's really profitable to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was the one linked with sugarcane. Do you have any information on that? I'm not a specialist on this, but there are a lot of questions that were asked, especially since the most important growth we saw in biofuels came from corn ethanol in the United States. And there, what we saw is a reversal of the programs that had been implemented in agriculture to encourage and foster respect of tree plantations along rivers, buffer zones, creation of riparian strips, all things on which we've worked for years and years to reduce the impact of agriculture on waterways were all reversed because suddenly it became very interesting to plant more corn close to waterways in order to produce corn ethanols because corn now had an important value in the market. But I was talking specifically about greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not an expert on this question. I know that indeed, depending on the crop that is used to produce the ethanol, the biofuel, we can get to different results in terms of life cycle analyses. In Quebec, efforts are being made to produce biofuels from forest residues. In a case like that, to my knowledge, the issue is not the same as for corn, for example. Ms. Gagnon, do you have any comment to give on that? I know that we mentioned in our plan, in our action plan for 2013 to 2030, 2013 to 2020, our climate change action plan. I know it's mentioned, but I have no specific information about incentives or disincentives for using biofuels. So it's not a major point, but since you evoked it, I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Bois. Just a compliment without being a specialist, Mr. Bonnet. A lot of studies demonstrate that first-generation biofuels involved crops that were dedicated to the production of biofuels. That tends to be more greenhouse gas emitting than certain types of oil that we can get directly in the soil. Less than others. It's always a case by case. It depends on the region. It depends on the type of crops, and it depends on the oil deposits. In Quebec, the preferred solution is really second or third generation biofuels, a bit like was mentioned by Mr. Nollet, fuels that are made from residual matters or crop residues that cannot serve for human consumption. And then instead of having waste to process and manage that could emit methane, those residues are used to make biofuel, and then we have an appreciable environmental gain that could be obtained here. Thank you, Mr. Grandbois. Thank you. A question by Ms. Grandbois. Yes. I would like to. Could you identify yourself and say what department you're from? Yes. Sergio Rasanas from the Department of the Environment. Okay. I would like to add something concerning what Mr. Benoit said. Could you get closer? Oh, yeah, of course. I would like to add something concerning what was said by Mr. Benoit. I would like to add mainly that the main controversy concerning biofuels, the main controversies are for the first generation biofuels. They concern mostly the first generation biofuels, as Mr. Benoit said. And it deals with two main issues. First of all, the competition with the production of food, and also the important effects on deforestation in certain regions of the planet. That problem is very significant in some cases, if there is biofuel done with palm oil, for example, which led to the significant deforestation events in some parts of the world. Also, in terms of the performance of various fuels, or they're clearly different. The performance of those fuels is clearly different. In that sense, among the first generation biofuels, as you said so well, the ethanol produced from sugarcane residues, what we call the bagasse, is of course more efficient in terms of energy efficiency. In terms of, it's better for the climate too, and in terms of growth, because of the growth. But, for example, the biofuels that are produced in Quebec are produced from residual matters, waste matter, which is a good thing too. So there is, it's not an agricultural source, and we take advantage of residual matters which otherwise would be thrown away, and so there's less problems with that. But of course, biofuels compete with a disadvantage with other sources of renewable energy, which is my opinion. Thank you, sir. Ms. Grandbois? I would have one last question, which is not about the greenhouse gases, but it's a question that didn't have an opportunity to ask in the previous sessions. So for Mr. Bergeron, we talked a lot about the Ottawa River, and you mentioned quite early last week that you were going through a process, you were taking steps. You hadn't not yet found a technical possibility of crossing the river in horizontal directional drilling. The location where you wanted to pass, it didn't work, it wasn't feasible. You looked at other places to use HDD, horizontal directional drilling, and we know that the concerns of several people were linked with a passage more in the surface with a pipe compared to a pipe that would be some tens of meters down under the riverbed. If ever your efforts to find a way to cross it with HDT, the Ottawa River, if ever your efforts didn't work, have you envisaged the possibility of going with a tunnel maybe? Madam Commissioner, all the options are still on the table. One of the options we considered is what we call a micro-tunnel. It's something slightly similar to a tunnel, but less deep. I would tell you that we're confident that the alternative location that we've shown you on the map the other day would be appropriate and potentially interesting. I will tell you that there's a little issue in terms of the permits to be obtained to do the work in the field. On the ground, discussions are ongoing to try to untangle the situation and have access to the pieces of land to do the tests as quickly as possible. We've been waiting for 6 months now to do the tests. We would very much like to do those tests in the spring as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Germain? I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to ask a question. Ms. Alizé Cochon left us with a written question on the theme of greenhouse gases. The question that was asked was for the Commission. How will the Commission analyze the GHGs? Will there be an analysis based on the national and international commitments of Quebec and Canada for the reductions of the GHGs in the short, medium, or long term? In other terms, what test will be applied by the Commission? As you can see, we had 2 sessions here. So the Commission, through the questions we asked, can confirm that this was part of our analysis. The question of the commitments of Quebec, the Quebec targets, and the possible Canadian targets, for which we don't have for the time being. If we get them during our analysis, we could incorporate them. Of course, that will be part of the Commission's analysis in its report. I can say that. Thank you, Mr. Germain. Here, this is what concludes our 13th session. I want to thank Mr. Jean-Yves Benoit and Mr. Jean Delay for their presentations. I thank the resource persons, of course, the promoter, the participants in the various rooms, and I ask you to come at our last session tonight at 7 p.m. about social impacts and governance issues. See you in a while.
Bon, fait qu'à tout le monde dans les salles satellites, on se retrouve à 6 heures pour faire les tests pour ce soir. OK.